Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here. I'm going to call the Atlantic Menhaden Management Board to order. My name is Joe Cimino. I'm the Administrative Commissioner for New Jersey. I'm joined by James Boyles, Caitlin Craig, TC Chair. We also had David Bailey from representing us for law enforcement, and Katie Drew is here. Online, we have Andrew Shell. We have quite a few agenda items to get through and most of the morning to do it. So let's see how we do. We'll start with approval of the agenda. Any edits on the agenda? Not seeing any. We'll consider that approved by consent. Move on to the proceedings from the February 2026 meeting. I see one hand, Dennis Abbott. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yes, thank you, Joe. The meeting attendance of the previous meeting does not show Doug Grout or myself as attending, and we were there. So I'd like that correction made.
Noted. Got that, Doug. Thank you. Any other corrections, additions to the proceedings? All right. With that one amendment by Dennis, we'll consider those approved as amended. Our next agenda item is public comment. So if there are any hands in the room or online, this part of the public comment period is going to be for any items not on the agenda. We have an action item today for a draft addendum, and I will allow public comment during that decision making. So any comments not on, or sorry, go ahead. I see one hand in the back of the room. And Pete, if you could just introduce yourself, and I'll give you 2 minutes, and then I'll look to Tony to see if there's any online hands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to mention, Peter Hemchak, Omega Protein. I just wanted to mention that the Science Center for Marine Fisheries has funded a second project for a team of scientists that are well known to this board, Latour, Gartland, Nesledge, Wilberg, and Schuler, to continue their work on developing the roadmap of research projects required to determine a biological basis for a biological cap in the Chesapeake Bay. They have identified, they have recognized the foundation of the cap lies in a tag and recapture program that ultimately would have to go bay-wide. And they have developed a proposal that was funded by the Science Center for Marine Fisheries earlier in March. And they have designed a pilot study to use acoustic pit tags with Menhaden and assess the survivability of Menhaden with the tags, and then they would broadcast them into the fishery and try and detect the acoustic pit tags to get a sense of the recaptures. So if you want to read any direct quotes by Doctors Nesledge and Latour, they were in the press release that was sent to everybody. And if you want to learn more about the SEMPHIS research program, there is an exhibit set up in the lobby. It is being manned by Joe Myers. He is the chairman of the Industry Advisory Board for SEMPHIS, and he represents the Sea-Watch International that harvests ocean quahogs and surf clams. So with that, I'll end my comments. If any questions, appreciate it.
Very good, thank you, Pete. I appreciate that. Any questions for Pete? As he mentioned, there is a table outside, and I appreciate Joe being here to man that table. It's a lot of great research being done there. Okay, I believe we have one hand online. Is that correct? Okay.
That is correct. And when you're done with the public comment, if you could come back to me for the
Yes, sorry, Tony.
Phil
Okay.
Zelzak.
Mr. Zelzak, go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, Chairman Cimino, thank you very much. My name is Phil Zalzak. I'm a recreational fisherman with family in Virginia and Maryland. I sent you an email this morning at 8 a.m. Here's what it said. In 2002, your state, New Jersey, ended Atlantic menhaden reduction fishery in New Jersey waters because it was an ecological and economic disaster. See the link to the New York Post article in your email. It's a great article. Last Friday, I sent you empirical data from the Potomac River Fisheries Commission documenting localized depletion of Atlantic menhaden in the Potomac River, a critical estuary of the Chesapeake Bay. I also sent you the status of osprey in the main stem of the Chesapeake Bay, which are starving to death due to the lack of menhaden in their environment. See the references I put in there. As someone who fishes the Chesapeake Bay and Potomac River, I want the same consideration that New Jersey fishermen have had for the last 24 years. I want nothing more, nothing less. I want you to demonstrate some leadership and make a motion to end reduction harvesting of Atlantic menhaden in Virginia waters now, just like New Jersey. Don't continue with the philosophy of rules for thee, but not for me. That would be hypocritical. Finally, if you don't make the motion, I'm asking the Maryland delegation to do so. Maryland commercial bait fishermen and recreational fishermen have suffered enough. I thank you for your time. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Zalzak. Tony, was that the last hand online? Okay, very
Yes.
good. Now, as I mentioned and then quickly skipped, Tony will be announcing any commissioners that are virtual only.
See if I can get this right this morning. I believe we have Adam Nowalski from New Jersey and JJ Miner from Virginia online, and Monica Martens from New York. And then for those of you that are not in the room and cannot see, we are being recorded this morning with audio and video.
Very good. Thank you, Tony. Okay. So with that, we will move on to our next agenda item, and that is consider approval of draft addendum 2 on Chesapeake Bay reduction fishery. So we're going to James Boyle. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so I'll start with a quick overview and recap of the process until this point, and then I'll move on to covering the contents of the draft addendum and the PDT's memo with further information that was requested by the board at the winter meeting. And the goal of today's meeting is to finalize the options in the document and consider approving it for public comment. First, I'd like to give a big thank you to the members of the PDT who spent not just a lot of hours in the meetings that I'm sure many of you were participating in, but also behind the scenes and doing the analysis for all these options. Okay, so a quick recap of the process. At the annual meeting in October, the board initiated draft addendum 2 to develop options to distribute the Chesapeake Bay reduction fishery cap more evenly throughout the fishing season and to reduce the bay cap by up to 50%. If the document is approved for public comment today, then hearings will be scheduled from June to July, and the board will consider final approval in August. So the first issue topic in the document is the level of the Chesapeake Bay cap and how it is set. The board, as a reminder, the board will have the ability to choose anywhere within the range of options, but for analysis and public consideration, the PDT drafted 5 options between the status quo and the requested maximum cut of 50%. So those options include a cut of 10%, 20%, 30%, and 50%. Sub-option 1, the 10% cut, when coupled with the in-year quota periods, if any are selected in 3.2 in the next section, they may provide a similar reduction to the 20% cut to the coastwide tack that was adopted by the board last October in an average year if the quota periods for some reason prevent full utilization of the cap. Under sub-option 2, the 20% cut, that reduction in the bay cap matches the reduction in the coastwide tack from 2025. Sub-option 3 provides an additional buffer when compared to the coastwide tack reduction to account for the uncertainty in how abundance in Chesapeake Bay correlates to the abundance of the coastwide stock. And sub-option 4 provides the most conservative buffer requested by the board. Section 3.1.2 considers automatic adjustments to the bay cap with adjustments to the coastwide tack. So option A is the status quo, where changes to the Chesapeake Bay reduction fishery cap can only be made through adaptive management as defined in Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden FMP, which is what we currently have now, where you require an addendum or amendment to change the Chesapeake Bay cap. In option B, the bay cap would automatically be adjusted proportionally to the coastwide tack by multiplying a conversion factor by the current coastwide, or by the annual coastwide tack, however that changes. That conversion factor, as we define it, is the bay cap selected in the previous section divided by the current 2026 coastwide tack of 186,840 metric tons. And once set, if this option is chosen, then the conversion factor would need to be changed through adaptive management. So for example, if the board selects sub-option 2 in the previous section, which is the 20% reduction in the cap, that gives you a bay cap of 40,800 metric tons, and the TAC was then changed to 150,000 metric tons, the new bay cap would be 40,800 divided by 186,840 metric tons, multiplied by that new TAC to get 32,755 metric tons. The PDT did consider an option to utilize the TAC and bay cap for 2027 as opposed to 2026 for making this conversion factor, but the PDT felt that having known values was more important than having the numbers that would theoretically be in place when this goes into effect. So the sub options under option B create potential limits on how high or low the cap can be adjusted automatically. Sub option 1 would provide the same minimum protection as the current bay cap, which has a maximum of 51,000 metric tons. Sub option 2 uses the current bay cap as the maximum value and the maximum reduction contained in section 3.1.1, which is a 50% reduction, as the minimum bay cap value. Sub option 3, the bay cap cannot exceed 87,216 metric tons, which is the highest bay cap value since a coastwide TAC has been in place and would have no minimum value. In sub option 4, the highest bay cap value since a TAC has been in place, the same value, is the maximum, and the maximum reduction contained in section 3.1.1, again, the 50% reduction as the minimum. And then sub option 5 uses the approximate upper and lower 95% confidence intervals around the 2012 to 2016 approximate mean Chesapeake Bay reduction harvest, those approximate values used to protect confidentiality, which is the same time period used for the current bay cap. So I'll also note, if option B, sub option 4, is selected in 3.1.1, then the lower limit for this sub option will be lowered to 25,500 metric tons. So if in 3.1.1 or option B, sub option 4 and 3.1.1 is the 50% cut, that would be lower than this minimum. So if that is selected, then this minimum would then be, and this is selected, then that minimum would be lowered. Changes to the TAC beyond these limits would not entail adjustment to the cap until the TAC is within the limits again. So that is to say, if the TAC increases well beyond the value corresponding to the maximum set by one of these options or sub options, then decreases in future years only slightly, the cap does not automatically decrease and then until the TAC re-enters the range of adjustments. And with that, I can stop for questions on this first section.
Okay, thank you. Questions for James? Not seeing any. Go ahead, James.
Okay, moving on to the Chesapeake Bay cap distribution. So table 4 from the addendum in briefing materials outlines a series of options to divide the bay cap into 3 or 4 quota periods with the objective of alleviating a concentration of reduction harvest that may prevent Menhaden from distributing throughout the bay to stationary gears. The options here aim to more evenly distribute the harvest throughout the year or delay harvest even further into the year to reduce the pressure on the initial ingress of Menhaden into the bay. I'll make a note that the fishery begins on the first Monday in May and ends on the third Friday in November. So depending on the year, the length of the fishing season is either 28 weeks and 5 days or 27 weeks and 5 days. The table outlines the length of each quota period for a season, assuming a 28-week, 5-day year. If the year is 27 weeks and 5 days, we simply remove 1 week from the final quota period for simplicity in implementation. Options B through E present options that with 3 or 4 seasons of roughly equal length or as close to equal as can be given the length of the fishing year. Options B and C are the most equal distribution of harvest, whereas D and E give greater emphasis on that objective to delay harvest to lessen the pressure on that influx of Menhaden into the bay. Options F and G present options with 3 periods of unequal length. So the extended first period further delays reduction harvest into the year compared to recent performance. But by increasing that short middle period is reflective of the peak reduction harvest in recent years. And the proposed allocations during the season are intended to allow the fishery to operate as usual as possible during this period. The PDT drafted 2 options to resolve overage. So option A is the status quo. Since there are no quota periods right now, would be no paybacks for exceeding the allocation of a quota period. Option B Any overage of a quota period would be deducted from the same quota period in the following year and redistributed to the final quota period in that following year. If the final quota period of the year incurs an overage that does not result in an overage of the total bay cap, there would be no adjustments to the final quota period in the following year. So by redistributing deducted quota to the final period, this option achieves the objective of preventing early harvests while still allowing for full utilization of the bay cap. So as an example, if the selected option divides the bay cap into 3 quota periods and the first period has a 1,000 pound overage, then the following year, the first period will be reduced by 1,000 pounds, and the third period in that following year will have 1,000 pounds added. This achieves the objective of moving harvest to the end of the year, but still allows for full utilization of the bay cap since there was not, in this scenario, an overage of the total bay cap. If the overage of a quota period is more than the allocation of that period, then the following year, that period is simply reduced to 0, and any leftover overage is taken from the next earliest period if there is one possible. Again, in those scenarios, they will be added. Any removed overage will be added to the final quota period. So the next section considers whether to close the fishery to mitigate the potential for an overage that would need to be paid back the following year. Under option A, there would be no fishery closure. Under option B, when 90% of the quota for a period is projected to be harvested, the reduction fishery would be closed for the remainder of that period and reopen at the start of the next period. Regarding rollovers, so option A would have unused quota from any quota period prior to the last period would be rolled over to the last quota period. This is complementary to option B under overages, where overages of the final quota period that do not result in an overage of the total bay cap are not paid back. On option B, unused quota would be rolled over evenly to all subsequent quota periods. So this option would potentially allow for recouping of underutilized quota for the remaining parts of the fishing year, but ensure that not all of the under harvest is caught in the following quota period. There is a sub option to option B where that can only be selected if there's 4 quota periods where unused quota from either period 1 or 2 are rolled over evenly to quota periods 3 and 4. But quota under harvest in quota period 1 is not rolled over to quota period 2. So any unused quota from quota period 3 would then subsequently be rolled over to quota period 4. This would allow for potential of some recouping of underutilized quota at the end of the year, and again, ensure that none of the under harvest is caught in the first half of the fishing year to maintain the goal of redistributing quota later in the year. Before I start transitioning fully to the PDT's memo of additional information, we did consider and reject some additional options. The first option would subtract a quota period overage from the total bay cap in addition to reducing the equivalent quota period the following year, thereby eliminating the need that I discussed in option B of overages to redistribute that deducted quota to a different quota period. The PDT rejected this alternative option to prevent reducing the total bay cap when it is not exceeded. And similarly, the PDT considered and rejected an option to prohibit rollover to again prevent reducing the total bay cap when it is not exceeded only due to an overage of a single quota period. And the third option would have distributed the deducted quota period proportionally over the remaining later quota periods. And given the stated objective to shift harvest later in the year, the PDT believes that the option for overages in the document where deducted quota is distributed only to the final period achieves that goal and also simplifies the document and simplifies the overage system. And I can take any questions on this section.
Okay. Well, I read it a couple times. And then James did a fantastic job of explaining it. Let's see if we have any questions on this section. Yeah, we have some hands coming up now. So I'll start with Steve Train and then Mike Louise after that. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, James, for, I guess, doing a great job of explaining it, but I'm still a little bit confused. If we could roll back a couple of slides, I've got a question. The payback periods into the next year, based on the quarter or the trimester that you went over, it doesn't sound like a payback. It sounds punitive in one area. It's not keeping the population in balance. There's a punishment for it. I understand that because you want to discourage this. The problem I have is, what if the overage isn't found till later? What if we have a computer error? What if we have a reporting error like have happened in other species where a fishery has gone over at no fault to the fisherman? And then there's this punitive piece in there for it. Is there any way if we pass this along like this that we can pull that back out?
So I don't think there's a system right now. In this system, the reason it's set up this way is that all of the quota accounting would have to be done or could be done between years. So in that scenario, we're not worrying about monitoring week to week. But in that scenario, if I understand correctly, the fishery doesn't know that they've gone over a quota period. We find out at the end of the year that quota period 1 was exceeded, and then that would be redistributed. So there's not a system in this scenario that would have like a forgiveness of that, so to speak. I guess in that scenario, if the quota period 1 was exceeded, they would still get those fish back, but in the end of the year, not in that first period, if that was the overage.
Follow up, Steve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So like I said, the punitive part is you're taking it out of the part of the year that you wanted to fish in or caught them in because you went over, we're trying to ration this. And so that wouldn't be, if the mistake was either in the reporting or the software or whatever other reason that's not known to the fishermen, they would still get the punitive part of it. It would just go the way it's written now. There's no way to get around that.
No, I don't think so. Maybe I'm not following, but I'm not sure. I don't think so. If they went over in that period and we only find out later, then yes, that's an overage. That would still be moved to the final period taken out and moved to the final period the next year.
Okay, so I have Mike, and then Renee, and then Joe Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions. The first one having to do with the timing of the quota periods. James, I wonder, so during the discussion as we were crafting and coming up with ideas for how this would lay out, there was some concern, and I understand the concern regarding the length of time between periods and how much administrative emphasis or administrative burden will be on the state responsible. Back in Maryland years ago, we used to manage our striped bass fishery on a monthly quota that we had to manage each month, opening and closing and restarting and everything. And it was a nightmare to get through. It took enormous amounts of time in order to manage that monthly quota throughout the year. And when I look at this, I think that some of these options, and I'm asking, but F&G, they have these small windows of time of only 6 weeks. And it seems awfully fast to be able to turn around management and being able to make sure you have all the data, that you need in order to manage that. Was there any discussion about that, the length of time in those two, the F&G? Did the PDT discuss it? Were there issues? Did Virginia bring up any concerns about the ability to manage a quota under a 6-week time period?
Yeah, thank you. So the overage system, we had discussed originally when we came before the winter meeting of having overage paybacks within the same year. So if you have an overage of a period, then the next period may have quota reduced, or maybe a period after that. And so that's where that short period issue was brought up. And so once we transition to this overage system in option B, where the overage is paid back the following year, then all of this accounting, even on a week-to-week level, can be done in between years. And so it seemed like administratively was enough time that we could figure that out.
Follow up, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Another entirely different question, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay. So going to the rollover section, in looking at the rollover section and the options in the rollover and what you presented on your last slide, it would make sense to me to have a full scope of options under rollovers, including a no rollover provision. The no rollover provision was removed. It was rejected. And just for my own edification, can you remind me or give me some thoughts maybe that the PDT had, or maybe a previous board discussion as to why? Was that voted out at a meeting, or was that something that the PDT determined that they wouldn't put forward as an option for no rollovers?
So that was something determined by the PDT, because when you had a no rollovers option, then you have two ways to manage that essentially. The way the overage system we have now creates basically a de facto rollover to the final quota period because it doesn't incur any penalties if the final period is exceeded, as long as the total bay cap is not exceeded. That's effectively a rollover to the final period. And so the only way to resolve that and have no rollovers would be either the final quota period being exceeded would incur its own type of penalty, in which case either you would have to, if you do the same redistribution thing we're doing, and you're taking quota period away from the final period, the only way to redistribute it is earlier, which is against the objective of the document. And so if you don't want to do that, then the only other thing you can do is take it off the total bay cap, in which case you're penalizing the whole bay cap for an overage in one period. And so the PDT had that option drafted at our last meeting. I'm sure some of you were on that meeting and saw that. And then afterwards, we discussed it and preferred that if we could get rid of the no rollover option, that would resolve that issue. And then we could have just this overage system.
Okay, good, Mike. I have a few other hands up on this side. So I'm going to go to Renee Zobel.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess Steve and Mike kind of led to some of my questions. I'm thinking about, I'm just not as familiar with the data reporting in this fishery. And I'm thinking of this as somebody who was the one who was monitoring in season for Area 1A for herring. So my understanding now is that there's less in-season monitoring. Can you just talk a little bit about how the data reporting, there's concrete periods, what kind of monitoring is happening, what kind of communication with the fishery is happening as far as where they are with the quota? How does that work? Just high volume fisheries, this gave me a little anxiety as somebody who was responsible for making sure that we were doing a good job of informing people and closing things down when necessary. So just a little more information there would be really helpful for me.
Sure, thanks. Now I will defer to Virginia on more specifics on how they interact with the fishery and how they receive the reports. But from our perspective, we receive weekly reports on the reduction fishery throughout the year. So in terms of monitoring for these kinds of overages, where we're on a week-to-week basis, we would have plenty of information to know how the quote, like in these weekly quota periods, where the quota was once we got to the end of the year. I do believe there is at least a 2-week delay from when like the last harvest might, or when a pound is caught to when that pound might show up in that reporting. So that was a concern with the shorter quota periods if we were doing in-season penalties. That may be something to discuss. We've had discussions with the MRC about if for the option where the fishery has to close it when it's 90% projected, that could come up as an issue. Same with, there can be large fluctuations week to week, so that same problem. But at least in between years for determining these overages, we have that week to week data.
Follow up, Renee?
Yeah, just a quick follow up to that, James. So just, some of that curiosity. And I know that we're dealing with a low number of participants in this case, essentially. But how is any of that feedback loop going back to the industry who's trying not to go over those periods?
Joe Grist, if you could help us out there.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'll do my best to help you out on this. I think the comment punitive was pretty good. So it's our responsibility to help manage this quota and to make sure they don't go over. We do it in every fishery we manage with quotas around this table. So it would be difficult. The way we would operates currently with Captain's Daily Fishing Reports, we receive them on Thursday from the week prior. So, depending on when that catch report for the week prior is, it could be up to 10, 12 days for some of those catches. And then we get confirmation through the plant a couple weeks later on the catch. So there's maybe a little difference. Initially in the season, we don't see a lot of difference in the numbers from the CDFR from what we get for the update. As we get later in the season, there may be a little bit more of a discrepancy, but nothing major. It's just, we just maybe have a little bit more difference later in the season. It's not set in stone how that happens. Some years it's straight up, and some years we see a little change. But the shorter these quota periods are, so if they fished last week and I get the report this coming Thursday, I'm already into the second week of fishing. And if it's a 6-week period or 7-week period, yeah, I'm only going to get a couple data points before I've got to projecting to whether or not I need to tell them, hey, this period's not going to work. You need to slow down or you need to stop before they go over in that particular segment. And that's going to be very difficult to do with the way the system is. Now, ideally, so, well, then go put in daily harvest reporting and all that. Great. Give me a person and some money, which I don't have either. And so until I have those resources, I have to deal with the resources that I currently have. And my resources I currently have, these make these shorter quota periods very difficult for us to manage. And it would be unfair to the harvesters for us to say, well, we'll just deal with it later. That's not good management. We wouldn't do that for any other species around this table. So yeah, the shorter periods, some of the ones like C and D and such, yeah, they're going to be hard for us to do work. So does that kind of answer part of that question? Since I did have my hand up, Mr. Chairman, continue just for a couple other things, and I'm not going to sit here and get on a soapbox or anything. We've mentioned the administrative burden that some of this stuff does do for us, so that needs to be taken into account. We're going to do everything we can to ASMSC directs, but some of this is an administrative burden. On the rollover provision, we already pay the bay cap back if there's an overage, which has only happened rarely in history has the bay cap been exceeded. But if it does, it gets paid back. So worrying about the rollover throughout the season, if the measure is just to set a cap that they have to adhere to, then let's just set the cap. And if there is a overage of the annual cap, then it gets paid back the next year, which is commonly done in most fisheries. If there isn't, no harm, no foul. If they can't catch the fish early on because the fish aren't there, they're going to get penalized if the fish are there later, but they now can't catch them. So not having rollover kind of goes against how we've done fisheries management for decades around here. We've almost always had some type of rollover provision. So I don't see where that's going to be real tenable to keep that in there. And if there's anything else, operational questions or anything, I'll be happy to ask them. Benefit of the board is we're going to do what we can to help guide y'all through what we can do in Virginia, because obviously at the end of the day, the addendum is on Virginia. We're the only ones it's on. So I'll be happy to answer any questions I can for the board.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that. And also want to welcome Melissa Alberto, a new commissioner from Virginia, who's joining us today. Welcome. I have one more hand so far on the list. Allison Cole. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not surprised that this rollover and overage section is getting a lot of interest and conversation. It is quite extensive. So thank you to the PDT and to you, James, for thinking all of these various scenarios through. I did want to just sort of present a potential counterpoint to some of the arguments about rollovers. And I think we have, it might help, James, if you could pull up the quota period options that have the percentages in the chart. Thank you. We are going to be hopefully eventually making a decision on an addendum, and we have in front of us these quota period options with expected percentage of the total bay cap across these various options. And presumably they reflect the intent of the board in terms of more evenly distributing harvest or allowing for, a delay in harvest for ingress of fish into the bay. And I'm sure that in making those decisions, we all have some expectations that those are roughly the percentages of the bay cap that would be achieved during those harvest periods. But the rollover provisions and the fact that there's not a limit on the amount of rollover in the options we have in front of us now means there could be some significant departures from the percentages that we see here, depending on how the fishery ends up operating. And so from my perspective, having an option in the document for no rollovers gives us, one, completeness of options, because to me, it seems like we typically always have either a status quo or a no action option that kind of rounds out the totality of a specific section, but also provides the opportunity for the board to have certainty that these are the percentages that we would see being achieved in those quota periods. And so I think the rollovers just introduces some more uncertainty, which we'll have to consider if this document moves forward. And so just have an interest in seeing that no rollovers, so we have the ability to sort of think through the totality of those options. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Allison. I'm going to head over this way. I have Nicole, then Nicola, and then in the back of the room.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually shared Renee's concern about the quota monitoring, and it was very helpful to hear Joe speak on Virginia's ability to actually track these periods throughout the year. But where my confusion lies is when you read the document, and James did a nice job of explaining how most of those sub-period overages were going to be handled in the following year. However, when Joe was speaking, he was talking like we typically manage quotas throughout the year, where we're proactively tracking the quota throughout the sub-period. And then we use the previous week's landings to do projections so we know if we have to have an early closure. It's not typical for an FMP to specify quota periods. Typically, we specify an overall quota, and then we leave it up to the states to manage it how they wish. But given that we are specifying the quota periods, I think it would be helpful to have some language in the document that Virginia is going to be doing some in-season tracking and that they are going to be doing early closures when possible. But I still have concerns, given what Joe said, about their ability to do so without incurring large overages on a regular basis, given the delay in the reporting.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, for something like that, I'm not necessarily going to look for a motion. If I feel if any board members had concern with that language, we'll let a hand come up. But otherwise, I think that that's something we could get in there. Nicola, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm on common ground with others. The document refers in this table to 9 weeks, 10 weeks. I believe that the reference period for those is the first Monday of May or whatever it is in Virginia regulation that establishes when the reduction fishery can begin. I'm seeing Joe Grist nod his head. So I think for the public's understanding of what these time periods mean, you might want to include that as a point of information in the background. I would note, however, that start date is not set in the FMP. So Virginia could potentially change that. So it leaves me a little bit questioning, how that then applies to the selection of any of these options. If the FMP said it's 7 weeks from the start of the purse-seine fishery, or the reduction fishery, and Virginia could change that, it feels like a little bit of a disconnect. And then I also had a question about some of these options. For example, D here, where it puts most of the harvest late in the last period, and some of the rollover provisions that would likewise allow for kind of the accumulation of allowed harvest into the last period. When I look at the beginning of the addendum, and it says that the intent is to reduce the concentration of the harvest, and even going back to the motion that initiated the addendum, which was to spread it out, it seems like those options are a little bit different from the intent as stated. So I just wanted to make sure that my understanding is that the PDT is kind of adapted, that intent to not just be to spread it out, but also to potentially push it to later in the year. If you could just kind of confirm that, and that's, I think that's okay that the PDT did that. I just want to make sure that is then reflected in the document.
Yeah, thank you. There are two kind of similar objectives, or related objectives. One is to spread it out more evenly, and the other was to push it later to protect the ingress. The 25, 25, 50 option and option D came from the board in the winter meeting. And so those two objectives we tried to work together. It also like fits into how the overage system works, but it is trying to match these two things up as best we can. Yeah.
Okay, Joe, did you have a response to the time period?
Yeah, I just want to make note. It's not a simple process for us to change that season. That's set in the Code of Virginia. So it would actually take legislative action to change that reduction season in the Bay. That's in code. So that's not an easy process. That is not something the agency could do through a standard monthly regulatory process. It would have to be a bill introduced and have to be debated. So could it be changed? Theoretically, yes. Easy to do it? No, not easy to do it at all.
Okay, I think, Malcolm, you were the only other hand I had.
I understand all the issues of administrative work, and believe me, I know we're run short in South Carolina all the time. When we're talking about the reduction fishery, we're talking about one entity, which I'm sure keeps great records. Why don't we throw the onus on them that they must be real time? You're not having to collate 4 or 5 different operators, but one single operator. And I don't see why we require real time for a lot of other fisheries, why they can't have an up to date, and the onus goes to them and then y'all proof it. You know, I'm just throwing out what I'm hearing this. I don't see why we don't throw it on the industry, since it's one entity. And when they come into Reidsville, they know what they offload, and it should be almost a real-time reporting. I mean, I may be incorrect, but just when I listen to this discussion.
Joe?
Thank you. We regulate by the vessel, not by the entity, not by the owner. So you're talking, I forget how many total are in the fleet at this point, those individual vessels. The other thing, those, because it's a common owner, they are protected by the confidentiality rule. So there's some complications to how that would be handled, but we do monitor the vessels. So if all the vessels are out, I think it could be a total of 7 or 8 different reports that we're getting in from the different vessels during that, that are due on that Thursday. So it's, you know, it's still on us to do all the verifications at the end of the day. I mean, we're the enforcement authority for the Commonwealth, so we have to be the ones that have the tools to do it. So I understand the perspective, but there is some complications to that.
Just to follow up though, we have other reporting systems where the dealer has to do reports from all the different people. Would this not be the same? You wouldn't need the 7 operators, but when they are offloaded in Reidsville, they know what they bought. And it seems like that would be real time, and not would it get around the confidentiality issues. You know, essentially make them a seafood dealer that's making the report. I mean, we don't deal with this in South Carolina, but it's just thoughts that were coming to mind.
Okay, Dennis Abbott, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like a little clarification. Joe Grist, I think he mentioned that he would have to go back to the legislature. I was under the impression that Menhaden management was removed from the legislature in Virginia and given to the agency. Is that not correct?
It is correct that we have regulatory authority, but there are still certain provisions established in the Code of Virginia that set certain standards that we can't change. And one is the season. The season is still set in the code. All our power comes from the Code of Virginia. So the code can establish boundaries that we have to adhere within. And that is a established Code of Virginia boundary is their season. That's not something we can just go and change on our own. We have to have the boundary changed for us to operate within it. That sets our regulation.
Thanks for the clarification, Joe. Okay. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an interesting conversation about who has to report, where the onus is and all that. I mean, for the boats that I deal with, they have federal permits and they have to have their VTR filled out when they hit the dock. And, then the dealer has to report twice a week, and that's how it goes. And so there's a check and balance there. But in the Menhaden fishery, it's really interesting because the boats that actually catch the fish are not landing the fish. It goes into carrier boats. So it kind of compounds the problem of who's going to report what and when. So, we have to keep that in mind. I'm sure there are some boats that are, they pull half the net and there's the skip that does the rest of it and they carry their own fish. But in the case of some of these bigger operations, the guy that's landing the fish didn't catch them. That's all. It's kind of a weird thing. So it makes it only more complicated. So I don't know how we figure that out.
Thanks, sir. Look to Tony for any hands online. Okay. Winding down on questions, it seems. Where are we? Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just kind of a simple question here. In terms of harvest that goes against the bay cap, is the pound net catch included in the bay cap, or is that part of the coastwide quota? Thank you.
Only the reduction fishery catch is counted towards the bay cap. So all landings are counted towards their state quotas. So the bay cap is still within Virginia's allocation, but the bait landings are all separate.
Yeah, I guess James has a couple more slides, so I'll turn it back to him.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's see. Okay. So the board also requested analyses for further consideration, including compare reduction effort with harvest data within the quota periods, to investigate the pound net reduction catch rates, to determine if pound net landings are correlated with the timing of the reduction fishery, and changes in pound net participation over time. So there's some discussion in the initiation of the draft addendum on the use of harvest or effort to develop the quota periods. So this table, which is also included in the PDT's memo and briefing materials, shows the approximate average landings from 2018 to 2024 since the current bay cap has been in place. The approximate average percent of landings and effort per quota period for the options in draft addendum 2. Since 2020, the distribution of effort is generally spread relatively evenly across the fishing season, with about 5 to 10% of the total effort occurring in most weeks, with occasional spikes and drop-offs. In 2018, more effort occurred early in the fishing season. 2019, it was primarily in 2 stanzas with very little effort for most of the month of July. The relative trend in catch per unit effort, or CPUE, was most variable in 2018 and 2019. So for the question regarding catch rates in the Maryland pound net and reduction fisheries, the PDT conducted a preliminary analysis to evaluate any potential link between the two, but does recommend to the board that the technical committee would be a more appropriate avenue to conduct a more detailed analysis. So in general, changes in the harvest may be caused by changes to fish availability, changes to effort, and or changes to fishing efficiency. So assuming, for the sake of this analysis, that there were no major gear changes to the fishery that would affect efficiency, the PDT investigated variability in effort and availability as potential causes for the decline in harvest that have been reported out of Maryland's pound nets. So figure 3 in the memo, which is on the slide, shows that harvest and effort in the pound net fishery, again, this is just for Maryland, was stable from 2018 to 2022, but declined significantly in 2023 and 2024. So while true abundance or availability is unknown, the PDT used CPUE as a proxy for abundance, assuming, again, that there were no major changes to how the fishery operated between years. So these data show that although annual CPUE has declined recently, the decline is not as dramatic as observed in the catch and effort, suggesting that the decline in landings is primarily driven by reduced effort. If we look at Maryland DNR's Choptank River Fishery Independent Survey as for comparison, between 2018 and 2023, the abundance appears to have been relatively stable, before a dramatic decline in 2024 and remaining low in 2025. To break this down even further, to investigate seasonal impacts, CPUE was evaluated on a weekly basis beginning in week 13 of each year. So from weeks 13 to 26, CPUE in both 2023 and 2024 is low relative to the average of 2018 to 2022, although it's unlikely this is due to the reduction fishery, as the reduction harvest does not usually begin until week 19 and was delayed until after week 23 in both of those years. So in the second half of the year, after week 27, weekly CPUE in 2023 is generally equal to or greater than the average from 2018 to 2022 until week 46, but which again suggests little influence from the reduction fishery, as by that time both fisheries have achieved greater than 95% of their annual catch and are generally winding down. By contrast, in 2024, CPUE is generally below the 2018 to 2022 average from week 31 through the end of the year. So that year, the reduction fishery began in week 23, approximately 5 weeks later than they normally had from 2018 to 2022, but by week 33 had caught about 60% of their annual harvest, which is in line with those earlier years. So it is possible that those higher than normal catch rates may have affected availability of fish in the upper bay, although the PDT does note that this is not conclusive and that any link between reduction harvest and availability in the upper bay would be a joint function of fishery dynamics and migratory patterns at a finer scale than we could consider for this analysis. And finally, the board requested additional analysis to explore trends in the number of participants in the pound net fisheries for Maryland, PRFC, and Virginia. Overall, all three jurisdictions saw a decline in the number of unique participants from 2018 to 2024, with Maryland seeing the biggest decline from 2018 through 2021. And since 2021, all three states or jurisdictions have between 10 to 16 participants per year. When looking at the number of unique participants by month, and there are further figures on this in the PDT's memo, there appears to be fewer participants by month during 2023 and 2024 for all three jurisdictions when compared from 2018 to 2022, although there does seem to be consistent variability by month throughout the time series without a clear trend. And with that, I can take any questions.
Questions for James on the memo? Okay, I have Emerson, and then I'll go to you, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, James, for your presentation. Excuse me. So do we know what might be causing the reduction in pound nets being fished in those states? You know, I mean, are people just getting out of the fishery? Are people retiring out of the fishery? I know some of this discussion had it related to Menhaden availability, but is there any correlation there between number of pound nets being fished and Menhaden availability? You know, a statistical correlation? Thank you.
I can't speak to why participants have been leaving the fishery and saw that decline, but you know, from this brief analysis, the catch per unit effort does seem to be relatively high compared to the decrease in participation. So CPUE has decreased from 23-24, but it's not as dramatic as the loss in participants, which suggests that there is some availability there for at least.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mine's kind of a follow-up question on the topic that Emerson brought up. I'm just curious. I mean, there's a good economic analysis in the draft addendum about the potential economic cost to Virginia to the reduction fishery if the reductions are made to the bay cap. Just curious in Maryland if any work has been done, how it has affected employment in the fishery in Maryland that would be similar to what was done for the reduction fishery, because as you showed there, the participation's gone down. I was wondering, as Emerson did, how much of that is due to the availability that people aren't setting the nets, or whether it's just gotten to be one of those things where it's a difficult fishery. It's a lot of work to work pound nets and people just have other ways of fishing, what the deal is.
Okay, one of our Maryland commissioners is going to help out there, John Russell.
Joe, I was talking to a friend of mine is commercial pound netter, 2 days ago before I came up here. And the reason why we're losing pound netters is they can't exist on just catching what we call rockfish, straight bass. For instance, Rob said that he went to his nets Friday, and she was full of striped bass. So you can't save striped bass. So he has to lower them and let them go. So, but they can't exist on just catching striped bass. They need the Menhaden. Menhaden is a staple that keeps them on the plus side. So there's a profit. So if they can't catch any Menhaden, they don't have a barrier between that and the striped bass. So normally they just catch striped bass and Menhaden. So without the Menhaden, and that's why we're losing our pound netters. In the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, I know around my area, several of them have just quit because it's just too expensive. Used to be you go in the woods and you cut 60 poles for a net or 100 poles for a net. And they were, the guy would let you cut them. Now they're $6 and $8 a piece for every one of those poles you catch. So that's what's happening in the pound net industry at home. Thank you.
Thank you for that insight, Russ. Other questions on the memo? Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is it the fisherman, does the license go to the fisherman, or does it go to the trap? I guess that's my first question. I'm not sure if I have another question after that. Maybe I do, but how does that work out? Does the trap have a license, or is it the person?
Mike Louisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, so a fisherman is licensed. That license gives him or her the ability to harvest fish with whatever means that license allows them. We have a range of different licenses that allow for different gears. If you have a license that allows you to set a pound net, in order to set that pound net, you have to have a declared site. We have a site registry around the bay. You have to have a location for that fixed gear to be placed. It has to meet all of the other regulations about distance from this or distance from that, and it's established as my license as a license holder. I have that spot reserved for my harvest. And before the season, we ask fishermen to give us an indication of how many nets they plan to set and fish that year. How accurate that is, it's hard to tell. I assume that it's mostly accurate. We're getting a decent handle on the number of nets set. But after that, once they've declared their intent, they have their net location, and they've told us that they're planning to set 3 nets and fish them this year. If they have 3 locations, that's as far as it goes, as far as they're legally being allowed to harvest from those nets. That's how we administer. We don't have any special permits. It's a gear that's associated with a license, and that information is given to us prior to the season.
Ron, did you have something to add for PRFC?
Yes, sir. So in Potomac River, it's a little different. So by regulation, we only have availability for 100 pound net stands, and they're held by a handful of watermen. So it's a little different on that. So.
Okay. Other questions? Russell?
To go along with what Mike was saying, when you stake your pound net, it has to have the license displayed on the pound net. So each pound net would have his license. My license would be displayed on that pound net, so it can be seen by DNR or whoever wants to see it.
Okay, I think we have our answer there. Eric, you can? Yeah. Okay. Spud.
Sorry, this is it's kind of intriguing. So I'm curious. So the CPUE determination, is that based on the catch divided by the number of nets that we know to have been fished, or the total number of nets that were actually allowed to be fished?
Yeah, good question.
I believe it's net sets which we know to be fished, but I can double check offline on what data we got from the states.
Joe Grist?
This is one of those phone a friend moments. So checking back in with the team that was doing it, they said it was the data included number of nets fished is what they've responded back with. So.
All right, thanks for that clarification. Not seeing any other hands on the memo. Okay, Max, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I might have missed it in the presentation, but I do see sort of a recommendation in the PDT memo for the TC to maybe do more work on the CPUE analysis. And I'm just curious, is there anything more that the TC could do with the available data to try to go a little more in depth with that analysis? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's some level of maybe of speculation, but if there has been a conversation, Katie or Caitlin.
We have not, the TC has not talked about this or seen these data. Obviously, the TC would also need to get confidential access for these data. I don't believe this analysis used any environmental data in it. I mean, I think there's maybe some additional things the TC could look into, but I don't think there's necessarily anything we could do to increase the confidence in the results, given kind of like, especially the short time period we're looking at right now.
Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one little extra piece of information I got from staff too. I did the phone a friend earlier this morning. And so I just want to clarify. So what we would be looking at for the unit of effort is the net set per day. It's how many nets were fished during a day. The thing that I want to make clear though is that pound nets are stationary fixed gear, and they're not always there to target one particular thing. Just last year, we had 29 different species reported using from pound nets in the Chesapeake, with the highest harvest being channel catfish, striped bass, gizzard shad, menhaden, blue catfish, and white perch. So these fishermen are out there fishing all sorts of areas of the bay for all different types of species. And so the catch per unit effort part and how many nets they fish and what their intended or what their expected catch is, I think may complicate that analysis a bit. I need to think through it a little bit more to understand it in my mind better, but I just wanted to lay that out there for, just a little background as to how our pound net fishery operates. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Every time I say I'm not seeing any hands, I see a new hand. So, but I think we are at a point where we can start moving into a discussion on the draft addendum. I think part of that could be starting us off with motions, if that might help a discussion along. I'm not going to object to that. As I mentioned, before we do take final action, I will go out to the public for public comment. Actually, I'll do that for any motions we have. Pleasure of the board on the draft addendum. And I will mention that we did have some suggested text edits that so once we do have a motion, if this is going to be going out, that motion would ask that it be as amended today. Okay, James, go ahead.
Just to jump in, thanks, Mr. Chair. I have a few more edits that I received, and one of them is in the option B of section 3.1.2, which is the automatic Chesapeake Bay cap adjustment. It's to add language on why the board would like to see, if the board would like to go forward with the sub options on having minimum and maximums, why the board would want to see, what is the justification for having a minimum as well as a maximum. In addition, more language in that text will be added to clarify what adaptive management is and show the section in Amendment 3. That's a minor change. and then language to show that the minimum does not affect state allocations, that the Bay Cap, for further clarification that the Bay Cap does not affect state allocations, and to clarify the table 2 of the same section, just clarify that table that the options is referring to, refer to options in 311, not 312.
Erica?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before we go into motions, I want to thank James for his time. He met with me on Friday. I found, as I think others around the table have found, that the document was a little challenging to follow. And I think these changes will help the public, which this document is intended for, to understand the options in the document. I also hope that the board can narrow down some of them and state more clearly their intent and the purpose for these actions so that the public can provide meaningful comment on them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time and going through that. I appreciate it. Pleasure of the board. Mike Louisi.
Somebody's got to break the ice, right, Mr. Chairman? So I mentioned earlier what the PDT discussed regarding rollovers. We talked about it briefly. James provided some thought about the rollover provision and not why the PDT decided not to have a no rollover provision in the document. I would feel more comfortable if this board decided that, to decide whether or not that no rollover provision should be an option in the document. So I would make that motion, Mr. Chairman, to include, the motion would be moved to add a no rollover provision to the rollover section of this document.
Okay, thanks. And we'll get that up on the board for you, Mike. I want somebody to be able to see what their secondings are. All right, Mike, it looks like we're starting to dial a phone number, but if you want to get that in, and then we'll see if we got a second. Okay, we do. Rob, I'm assuming that's a second. So a second by Rob LaFrance.
Yes, thank you.
May I provide some rationale, Mr.
Yeah, let's do that, Mike.
Yeah, for me, this is more about the completion of this section and having a full rounded out, very, all the different degrees of options, from no rollovers to having the rollovers as they're already addressed in the document. I just think it offers a more complete picture of the situation. At this time right now, thinking it through, I'd need to think through how it all works, as to whether or not I would support this at the end. But I definitely think that the public deserves the opportunity to consider this as a management tool for how we deal with the Bay Cap. And so for me, this is a lot about process and inclusion to be more complete. Thanks.
Rob is the second.
I think that's accurately states the reason I would be supporting this motion as well. The notion of setting out all the different options for the public to be able to take an understanding of. I think after this happens, I'm also, after hearing some of the debate here, thinking about some of the other things we have to do in the document. So this sort of sets a placeholder or an explanatory perspective. And I think it's important for us to do that. And I think there's going to be other changes to the document in terms of its complexity. I think this actually simplifies it.
Okay, further discussion. Let's go around the table. Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Though I understand the arguments being made, I find this motion is punitive. If we have a situation where we're not overfished, we're nowhere near the Bay Cap, and the first 2-3 segments, they didn't catch up because the availability of the fish wasn't there. Because we are seeing some changes in availability year to year in the Bay now. It took times of the year when the fish are actually available. They don't operate by a calendar as much as all of us wish they did, make our lives a lot easier around this table. I see this as an option that could, if it were to make it all the way through, it'd be very punitive. It's not any fisherman's fault if fish don't show up at a certain time of the year and they don't get to catch them, but later in the year they do show up. The cap is the cap. At the end of the day, it's the total cap for the annual that's going to rule the day. The segments is a management tool. But now we're talking about basically making individual segments caps, mini caps, completely independent of the next. And that just seems a little bit, it just seems very punitive in this approach. We have an overall bay cap annually. You want a management by segments to control the harvest through the period, fine. But now we're this literally, if this were to go all the way through with public opinion and this board, something like this would basically create 3 or 4 bay caps in a year. And that makes no management sense. I don't understand the argument for that whatsoever.
Other discussion around the table, John Clark?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Joe. I mean, we have a cap for the bay, and as he said, this would be a situation where each one of these trimesters or quadmesters, whatever they are, is its own individual cap, and that I think is beyond the scope of what we were considering before. So I don't think this should be in.
Doug Rapp.
Just to be clear, we currently have a no rollover provision for the total bay cap. Is that correct?
The bay cap cannot roll over from year to year.
From year to year, yeah. And this, you're specifically talking about having a no rollover option between periods only. Okay.
Thanks for that clarification. I think that's good for everybody. No hands online. Allison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I already spoke about this concept a little bit earlier in the Q&A portion, but I think something that Joe mentioned just struck me in terms of the availability of Menhaden in the Bay and the changing availability of Menhaden in the Bay. And I think this no rollover provision also provides an opportunity for some really important information to be gathered in that regard. You know, if there are changes to, you know, timing or availability for various reasons, not being able to catch the cap in any particular quota period is really important information for this board to kind of understand those dynamics, especially in the absence of having a Menhaden specific survey within the Chesapeake Bay. And so I think that this is just another tool as well, considered across the entirety of all of the options that we have in the document that could provide us some of that much needed information that we're missing.
Other hands around the table? Not seeing any. I will give the public a chance to comment directly to the motion. Anyone that wants to speak will have 1 minute. If you could introduce yourself, and we'll start the 1 minute.
Hi, my name is Ben Landry. I'm here representing Virginia's Menhaden fishery. We oppose this motion for the very reasons that Joe Griss laid out. It's a punitive measure to ensure that less fish are caught in the bay. If the goal of this entire effort is to reduce fish at the beginning of the year, then catching it on the back end of the year should not be the goal. I mean, Joe laid out the fact that you now have a coastwide quota. You have a bay quota that applies to one company and one company only. Bait fishermen can catch whatever they want. A Menhaden used for reduction serves the same ecosystem role as a Menhaden caught for bait. And now you're creating 3, possibly 4 sub-regional bay quotas. And without the rollover provision, it's just a punitive measure. So I appreciate your consideration.
Yep, thank you. I see some other hands. Will, go ahead.
Hey, Will Poston, I'm with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I'll speak in support of this motion and touch on something that hasn't been mentioned yet. The utility of this option is really defining the range of alternatives for this board's consideration. And without it, the board is fundamentally constrained in what it could consider in a final action period. So I think including this option in public comment will grant the board flexibility in potentially making a final decision. And again, the utility of a quota period in the Chesapeake Bay cap is to buffer against these changing availability and changing Menhaden dynamics that will provide a buffer for the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem needs, and again does not preclude this industry from fully utilizing its quota. This option would just prevent overutilization in the Chesapeake Bay. Thank you.
Go ahead, sir, if you could state your name.
Good morning, happy Cinco de Mayo there. My name is Brian Collins. I'm a citizen in Alexandria, Virginia. And regarding the amendment, I think there's a major flaw that's not been considered. And that is that you all, I'll say it like that, authorize 277 million pounds of menhaden to be caught all in Virginia. And I'm not sure you all ever think of it that way. 126,000 metric tons. Granted, the industry can all be caught in Virginia, even though we know there's other areas. And it doesn't appear there's any acknowledgement that the highway along the eastern shore of Virginia into the bay is crucial for the population that is actually in the bay. I'm not saying I'm technically certain of this, but I think it's highly likely that industry could cut off the flow into the bay. And they do that. They fish heavily along the eastern shore. And essentially what we're saying is there's no need to leave any menhaden behind for the wildlife, the Australian collapse, striped bass ring collapse, all-time lows, and blue crab.
Thank you, sir. Other hands? Pete, go ahead.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. There's a comment made at the board table whereby the justification for no rollovers was that in a particular interval, if there was an underage, and in another interval, there's another underage, then you would be learning something about the entry of menhaden movements in and out of the bay. Well, that doesn't seem like a justification for not having rollovers. If there's an underage and you allow for a rollover, you will still know that there were fewer fish caught in whatever interval you're being measured. Thank you.
All right, that's all the hands I see in the room. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the board. Are we ready for the question? Do we need a caucus? Okay, I'll give 1 minute for caucus. All right. I think one thing to consider before I ask the question on the motion, I think part of the PDT's concern was that perhaps this did not fit with the intent or the statement of the problem. So I think the board does need to consider that additional language for the document may also need to be included if this does pass.
Just to follow up on that, thank you, Mr. Chair. If this does pass, I will also need to come to the board for how the board would like us to handle the overage provision.
Okay. To the question, and I could read this very brief motion with a lot of numbers. Move to add a no rollover provision to section 3.2.2.3. All of those in favor, please raise your hand.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Maryland, New Hampshire.
Thank you, Tim. All of those opposed to the motion, please raise your hand.
Maine, Delaware, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Virginia, New Jersey, New York. Oh, sorry. Okay, not voting. New Jersey, no.
Okay. No votes?
New Jersey.
Abstentions?
Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA Fisheries.
Okay. So the motion passes 10 to 5 to 2 to 1. All right, so we gave a preview of what would happen if this motion passed, and now that it has, I'd like to hear some comments on how this now may change the problem statement, and then, as James pointed out, the important discussion on how to handle quota overages. Thoughts? Yeah, well, Matt, you had your hand up. You wanna?
I'll let you wait if you had a thought there, but I do have some thoughts on this when the time's right.
Okay, we'll let James get us started.
Just as a reminder of like what the PDT discussed when considering this option is, and as I mentioned, I alluded to a little bit earlier in the questions, is that if you have a no rollover provision, you can there's a few ways you can go. Either you have every quota period, an overage in a single quota period simply comes off the total bay cap from that period. So the bay cap is lowering as quota periods are lowering. That's number one. Another way would be what the PDT had drafted in our last meeting, and then once we removed the no rollover option, this is what was removed, which is that in overages of the first early quota period, so 1, 2 in a 3 quota period system, or 1, 2, 3 in a 4 quota period system, those would be distributed to the end. But then, oh no, sorry, no rollovers. Those would be I'd have to double check. But an overage of the final quota period, the upshot of that was the overage of the final quota period would come off the total bay cap. Yeah. So that was the two options that the PDT had discussed as ways to move forward with this. So obviously we can consider those, but also open to other suggestions from the board.
Matt, are you ready?
Sure. So I was going to address some issues with the problem statement to start with. Right now, the problem statement talks about the need for reducing or distributing the catch throughout the quota period. And I think one part missing from that is something I think we saw in an earlier draft, was that the board initiated this action as a precautionary measure, not just willy-nilly. It was sort of as a precautionary thing. So I think that's something we need to include in there.
To that, Tony?
So I'm going to ask this board to be very specific because the PDT cannot read into your minds. Why are we being precautionary? What is it that you want the PDT to put into their statement of the problem?
Did you have a follow-up, and then I'll go to Allison?
You can go to Allison first, and then I'll
All right, go ahead, Allison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was also struck by the problem statement, and it's already been touched on once during the discussion today that there are several motivations, I think, based on our board discussion. I did note this morning, looking back at some of our previous documents, that the Chesapeake Bay Precautionary Work Group report came out a year ago. And, there was a lot of discussion around initiating that work group. There was a lot of discussion around the outcomes of the report of that work group. And so I can understand how over the course of more than 12 months of discussion that has led up to today's meeting in this draft addendum, that those conversations have ebbed and flowed and evolved over time. I do think that what the problem statement is currently lacking is information, some of which was captured in the Chesapeake Bay Work Group report, about concerns about changes in availability, whether those are driven by environmental changes, by fishery changes, but the dynamics that we were observing in the Chesapeake Bay, in addition to just the bait fishery dynamics, but also some of the ecosystem and ecological dynamics that were sort of the impetus for kicking off that work group report. And that's where we get into some of the multiple objectives of this document that were discussed earlier relative to the quota periods. We have options that more evenly distribute the harvest across the entire season, which was something that was in certain cases related to the ecological concerns. We have things that move options further, move more effort or more landings further into the season, which is related to some of the ingress concerns. And so I think that as drafted, the options in the document really capture those multiple conversations that we've had and the multiple motivations that have been expressed by this board, but that the problem statement in the background doesn't necessarily reflect the totality of what is seen in those options. So if it could be drafted to reflect not just that sort of ingress concern, but also some of the ecological concerns, I think we would have a more complete background. Thank you.
Further thoughts? Not, I think it would be valuable to have, discussion about the overages. Go ahead, James.
Follow-up question to that one. If the even distribution is responding to the ecological concerns discussed at the board, can you be more specific on how that is achieving those goals that we can put into the document?
It's okay to respond, Mr. Chair. I don't want to, sort of speak single-handedly for everyone around the table, but one of the things obviously that came up in our work group was extensive conversations about ospreys, for example, and the concerns about, May through July and August being when fledglings are most in need and the predatory demand of osprey in the bay are the highest. So things that redistribute that peak in the summer are things that are more likely, in my mind, reflective of those ecological concerns.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back and this whole discussion about overages and payback in the same year as I'm understanding it. Operationally, that's going to be very challenging. Maybe we can respond quick enough from first segment and apply that to figure out what the last segment, whatever that looks like, could be, maybe. But there's an in-between segment we'll be working off of too. So if I'm hearing some discussion correctly, the thought is we would cut in season. If we saw an overage in, say, segment 1, segment 2, we're responsible to cutting segment 3 or 4, make up for that overage. Operationally, the way the system works today, that would be extremely difficult to do. And I understand the comments that were made earlier about, well, kind of suggestion to a new system. Okay. Last time I remember we implemented something around this board in one of the more recent meetings that required a state to change how they did things. We gave them 2 to 3 years to implement that. We were reasonable about it. We want this in place for next year, is my understanding around the board. I'm not going to be able to do that. So let's be realistic about some of these recommendations operationally, because again, we're the ones having to do it. And it's easy to say, well, change your system and all that. It's not that easy to do in a short amount of time. I need some resources. I need the time to plan for something like that. And even then, short segments are very hard to manage on minimal weeks. So I just like to keep some reality into managing this. So if we are going down this path, at least make it where it's realistically achievable. And otherwise, Virginia is going to be kind of set in a really bad spot trying to achieve something we may not be able to achieve. And for the state directors on the table, I think you know what I'm talking about. We don't like to be set up for failure.
Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think if I understood the proposal properly, that an overage in an early period would be paid back in the same year later on. It seems like there's not enough motivation in that situation to uphold the intent of the quota periods. it would essentially allow all the harvest to happen in the first period, and the only payback would be that you can't harvest in the third period and to stay within the bay cap. So I think the only option I'm seeing to include, along with the no rollover option, is that an overage is paid back in the same period in the following year. That would be my suggestion. And that was one of the things that the PDT removed, along with the rollover being prohibited. It seems to me that those two things both have to be in there, or the quota period deduction in the next period has to be back in there if the rollover is prohibited.
Yeah, James.
So just to clarify, so in that scenario, you take it from the same period the next year and the total bay cap is lower by the same amount the next year, right?
Can I ask a question about that?
Go ahead.
Is the total is reduced in the next year, but also that individual time section, that particular quota period would be reduced. So for example, if you overaged in this year in the first period, then the overage would be reduced the following year in the same period. Okay.
Tony.
Is it the board's intention, if the bay cap was not exceeded in that first year, to still have the entire overage from that first period come out of the second year? So in essence, lowering the bay cap in the second year, even though there was no total overage?
So if I could respond, my own perspective on that would be, you wouldn't change the overall cap, but you would reduce that first period in the following year. So more could be theoretically caught in the second and third if using 3 periods.
So you would redistribute
You would,
that what you
you
took away from period 1 into period 2 and 3
in the following year.
in the following year.
Because currently you are basically saying you took it in this year. The reason we are trying to discourage that means you won't be able to do that the following year. But I don't think it should affect what the overall bay cap is. That's going to be a separate discussion.
Okay, so if I can think that, so this is what the PDT was discussing. So if you have an overage in period 1, you remove it from period 1 the following year, then you have 2 options. Either the bay cap is lowered by that same amount, or you redistribute it to the third period as we have set up. But then what happens when if there's an overage in the last period? And so that's where the overage in option B comes in, where we say specifically that overage of the final period that do not eclipse the total cap are not paid back, which is effectively a rollover. And so I'm looking for what the board wants to do to that. If there's an overage if there's overage in period 1 and 2, then that's fine. We can redistribute it to the next year to 3. But then if there's an overage in that third period, what happens? And so the option the PDT considered was that only for overages of the third period that do not exceed the bay cap, then the bay cap is lowered by the same amount, because we don't want to redistribute it earlier according to the objectives.
So if I understand your scenario, you're in the last period, you're having an overage. There are 2 options there. There's an overage of the entire bay cap, and then there's just an overage of that last period. So in the event that it's an overage of the entire cap, I don't know how is that mathematically possible, I guess is a question. So if you, well, no, it is possible. I'm sorry, because you've overaged. So yes, in that regard, as a status quo, if you go over the cap, the next year's cap would be reduced by the amount that you went over. That's my understanding.
Yes, but in the scenario where the total cap is not exceeded, but just the last period, then because we don't want to redistribute that overage that you're taking away to another period, an earlier period, what happens to that quota you take out of the third period?
Wouldn't it be the same as before? In other words, the overage would then be reduced in the third period. It's the same. I understand the distinction you're trying to make, but it's the third period that's being overaged. So you would just move it forward into the following year. That'd be my sense of it.
But Rob, what we're trying to say is you're saying, you said before that you're not going to penalize the Bay Cap in the next year if you don't exceed it. You said before, if there was an overage in period 1 or 2, you would redistribute it back to period 3. But if the period 3 is where the overage occurred, and the board is telling the PDT you cannot redistribute to period 1 and 2, then you're penalizing that overall quota in period 3 because you're taking it out of period 3. So that second year's quota
it's
is
being-
effectively reduced.
But it's being penalized because they overaged in that third quarter from before.
But there was not an overage of the full Bay Cap.
I understand. I mean, I see your
Okay.
point, but I guess my point is we're
So
trying to get
it's
people
changing the
you're trying.
statement of the problem again. I'm just
I
putting
mean,
it
I don't
out
know.
there
You
for
can look at the
everybody.
statement and make that discussion. I mean, I don't know that the
Yeah.
statement of the problem gets to that level of detail. That's the point of this particular issue, right? So now you're going to have this go to public notice and people can have their opinion as to whether that is or isn't punitive. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say is I think we should look at it that way, which is part of the reason we included it to begin with, because we wanted to have people have the option to discuss it.
Okay, we have a few other hands. I saw Nicole first, and then I'll go to Steve.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding because I feel like some people around the room might be confused. And so what you're trying to explain is that if you have a overage in the third period in a 3-period scenario, that in the following year, if you don't exceed the entire Bay Cap, you would essentially be reducing the Bay Cap in the following year by taking it just out of period 3. That's what you're trying to say. And so even though we didn't have an overage to the full Bay Cap, you would be reducing it in the subsequent year because there's no redistribution to periods 1 and 2. So I don't see any other options except unless the board, maybe if we don't redistribute it to periods 1 and 2, we could just redistribute to period 2, but that's still transitioning it to earlier, but it also is complex because some of the options for the periods vary so drastically in the percentages. It's kind of hard to work through not knowing what those percentages are going to be because in one scenario, it may be okay, but in another, it may not, we may not be comfortable with that.
Yeah, and I think this is precisely why the PDT didn't want to go there because, their understanding was that if we were not going to force a penalty on the overall Bay Cap, if there was not an overage the year before, then this situation, new marching orders. Other hands, Steve, I apologize. Steve Train and then Allison and Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we've already been through this, but I just want to read it one more time and see if it helps because I can add one thing afterwards. On 3.22.1, option B, any overage of a quota period would be deducted from the same quota period the following year and redistributed. We all know that. If the final quota period of the year incurs an overage that does not result in an overage of the total Bay Cap, there would be no adjustments to the final quota period of that year. So what I see here is if we're worried that because we're setting these numbers, that period continues to be in violation because they're going to catch up whatever was left over from other periods, then we either say, well, we're going to accept it because we're not punish him, and we just make that last period basically whatever's left every year, or we state that it's going to be dropped from the quota. And if we've decided that this many fish should be harvested, in our science and around this table with all our knowledge, we said you can take this tonnage out of the bay. I don't know why we would punish them for taking it all at the end if they didn't get it earlier.
Thank Allison and then Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, James, I guess I'm just asking for maybe a recounting, possibly again, since the no rollover option and the option to take an overage in the final quota period off the top of the cap were the two options in the document put forward by the PDT and then later removed. Can you just state one more time those two options and kind of the discussion around with the PDT around those two options?
Yeah, so the PDT prefers the overage drafted option B, which is where, because we think it fits the objectives given to us the best, where you are moving harvest later. If there is an under harvest in periods 1 and 2, but they catch up to the cap in period 3, that's fine. And so for rollovers, they were kind of created in not a silo, but separately to consider the full range of possible rollovers. So you had no rollover, full rollover, partial rollover. And it was then realizing that having a no rollover option meant we had to have some sort of overage option that wasn't option B to account for that third period. If there was an overage of that period that did not cause an overage of the total bay cap, but where option B allows for that to catch up to the cap, a no rollover option would not allow that. And so, given the instructions, the PDT figured you can't redistribute that overage earlier to the year to allow the full bay cap to be harvested. And so your only other option is to take it off the cap, but only if it's an overage of that period. And so you can still redistribute from periods 1 and 2 if it's 3 periods. But then if it's that third one, that comes off the cap. And so they drafted that to resolve that conflict, but then decided that it was preferable to remove the no rollover option to resolve that conflict instead of having a situation where you would be taking off the bay cap that wasn't exceeded, because that was what they interpreted the board's instructions to be.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you for that recounting. And I think with the motion that just passed the board, it seems as though the board has interest in the no rollover option. And if that's the case, and the PDT developed an option that would resolve that, and obviously the PDT has a preference for one option, the board has a preference for the completeness of the no rollover option. It seems to me as though, and I don't think it would be unprecedented for a management document to have kind of an if-then approach between the two sections, that if option A is selected, no specifics here, option X is selected, then Y in the next section. If option B is selected, then Z or whatever. Because one begets the other, even though they were created in silos, because those conversations happen differently. I see a situation in which, because they are complementary and linked in to make this system work, maybe that's just how we communicate those options in the document that makes that a feasible option.
Joe Grist and then Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Listening to the discussion and everything, it dawned on me that this discussion sounded a little familiar for some of us on the council. And if anyone on the council, Mid-Atlantic Council, remembers the last meeting, we had a very robust discussion about SCUP. We have 3 periods. And the way SCUP fishery works is the individual periods, if they have overages, you pay it back the next year, only if and only if the overall annual is exceeded. That management strategy works great. A lot of people know about the SCUP fishery this year knows that winter period had a very large overage this year. And we're going to be kind of holding our breath through the year to see if there's an overage of the annual, to see if that has to be paid back or not. But the really striking thing about that overage was it wasn't the industry's fault. It was the manager's fault that it happened. In fact, we had some industry members stop fishing when they knew we were probably at the quota. Managers couldn't act fast enough. And we still end up with a big overage. So some of this discussion reminds me of that council discussion with SCUP. And we have the rollover situation. If there is an overage in a segment, whatever we want to call these things, say there's an overage in segment 1. But if we get to the end of the year, we didn't go over what this board sets as the cap, then why does that segment need to do a payback the next year? Unless we're going down again the same path of we're basically setting multiple caps, which never was the intent of this addendum and document from what I remember when this was introduced last August.
Thanks. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. I'm thinking along the lines of what Joe just brought up. So I'm struggling with a statement that I keep hearing. And the statement is, if there's a overage of the last quota period, but there's no bay cap overage, what do we do? My question to this group is, how does that happen? How do you have an overage of a period at the end of the year that is essentially kind of a catch-all for all of the leftover slop that happens either the previous year or this year? And that last quota period is everything that's left. How is the situation one that you exceed the quota period, but not the bay cap? Because it should be equal. Whatever you catch in that last quota period should be all that's left over from all the other calculations for that particular year to the current 51,000 metric tons. So that I'm having trouble figuring out how you'd have an overage in a quota period at the end and not exceed the bay cap. And maybe I don't know, maybe somebody can help me think.
Yeah, Tony's going to help.
Well, Mike, I guess I have a question back to you because the motion that was just passed said you are not allowed to roll over from period to period. So it's not a catch-all. I mean, you can't roll over underages. So it's not a catch-all. It's only what is allowed for that period. So your rationale doesn't add up for me.
So in 2027, if I exceed the first period quota by 1,000 pounds, in 2028, the first period quota would have 1,000 pounds less to start out, but quota period 3 could potentially have an extra 1,000 pounds added to it. That's the calculus that gets you to the setting up the current year. And that last quota period with that additional 1,000 pounds should be the quota period quota, not the baseline quota that was assigned to it given the percentage. But the what's established as that period's quota should be the quota, and we should just be held to that. That's how I'm thinking this through. I don't know if that addressed your question, Tony.
So I think there's a disconnect between what happens between years and what happens within a year. So the no rollovers is referring to within a year. So even if between years, you resolve some sort of overage so that the third period may be higher for some reason because of an overage in a previous year, you still end up in a situation within that year where you could under harvest periods 1 and 2. You get to period 3, you didn't allow rollover. So all that under harvest is lost. All those pounds under harvested is theoretically lost in the no rollover situation. So then you could have an overage in period 3 that does not exceed the bay cap. And so then your options are either allow for redistribution the other way to earlier or take it off the total bay cap. And so we could do, to Allison's point, we could do an if-then kind of linking overages and rollover options. But yeah, I just want to be fully clear on what the board would like to see as how we resolve that last period overage.
I have Erica, and the list goes on. So.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We've been talking about this for 2 hours now, and I think we've gone backwards quite a good ways. That's in my opinion. If we do this, then we're going to do this, but maybe we're not going to do this. I really think we should stop. And no offense, James, but maybe you ought to take another shot at giving us this document again, because it's not ready for prime time. I mean, there's a lot of smart people here that are so confused. I can't keep up with you. So that would be my suggestion at this point. You can go on as long as you want, Mr. Chair, but I think we have to take a little pause here before we move this document ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, it's certainly a thought, Eric. I don't know that we'll get to a comfort level on this, that the board isn't going to want to see it again before it goes out. So, but we do have some hands up. We'll try and get through them. I'll go to Erica, Emerson, Ben. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric and I are having a mind meld across the table here. I had the same concerns when I read the document that was provided in the briefing materials. I'm also hearing the conversation here and hearing more confusion among the board members with whether something is an in-season or a inter-season action. And I think that needs to be more clear. I think people are voting on things and having discussions about things and talking about very different things here. And we're going to get into a more and more complicated place. I think sending this back to the PDT, having them come up with more descriptive words in the document to make sure that everyone feels comfortable that they're talking apples to apples is really important. The only way we're going to be able to move this conversation forward. Thank you.
Noted. Thanks. Anybody remember what I said? Emerson, Ben, Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad to hear the previous two comments from Erica and Eric. So I've been getting a little frustrated here listening to this go around the table and back and forth. And I'm wondering where we're going with this. I mean, if James and Joe, Mr. Chair, we're trying to get a sense of the board, I don't think we've got any kind of sense of the board here. So if we're going to continue this discussion, I think we're better off if somebody puts a motion up and we debate the motion and we get to an end point rather than just keep going around and around the board, around and around the tables here. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to keep it brief. I wouldn't oppose some of those comments that were just made, but I did want to speak one point to the no rollover, and just if this is an option, it sounds like James is taking kind of notes on what is the intent. And so the intent was when we were voting was that it would be rolled over the next year, not in season, and also that would never affect the full cap. And so is it something that could be suggested that if there was this no rollover as voted, that would only pertain to the first portion? It actually would not even pertain to the last. So it just you wouldn't even have that issue. It doesn't have to pertain to that last piece. If there is enough quota left in that last period, whatever it is, third, fourth, whatever it is, then they should be allowed to have that. That is the cap that was determined. I think that was some of the comments, and that was the intent when we were voting. So I don't know if that's an option, but wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to confirm my interpretation was referring to the rollover section. We're talking about within year. If it was the interpretation of the board that we were talking about between year rollovers, then that's perfectly fine. And then this issue is still resolved. We don't allow rollovers between years. We don't intend to allow rollovers between years, at least in the PDT discussions. So that would not cause a conflict unless there's disagreement on the board on what the motion meant.
So I do have a few more hands up. I think we should be going along with the presumption that this is a document that needs to come back to us, and we can start talking timelines soon, but I'll try and get through the other hands. Doug, and then Allison, you had your hand again.
I was going to make a motion to reconsider our previous decision, considering rollovers. It seemed like this is when we really started getting wrapped around the axles because of the consequences of that now being part of the document, and how that would affect future years' quotas, particularly when we're dealing with if the overage was in the third year, our third period. So as a state that was on the prevailing side, I'm going to try that. I'm going to make a motion to reconsider the previous motion that we just, and see if we can change that, and go back to looking at the document as is. We may end up having to delay it anyways, but I seemed like that was the thing that really got us wrapped around the motion.
All right, thanks. This will require knowing Robert's rules and math. All right, for this 2/3 vote here. So do we have a second to reconsider? Another hand?
Point of order. Point of order.
Joe Grist.
I believe you need both the motioner and seconder to be from the prevailing side. So you got to make sure it's from the prevailing side to do this.
Malcolm, was that your hand as well? For that same point of order? Okay. Oh, your hand is to reconsider. Okay. So I don't think, unless we're no, I think it was to the point of order, correct, Malcolm? Right. Okay. So we still need a second from the prevailing side. Bob?
Do you want me to read the list of prevailing states to maybe help people out? Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Maryland, and New Hampshire. So those states were on the prevailing side of the motion that was passed today.
Okay. Thanks for that and for having that on the record. Not seeing any other hands.
Yeah, not commenting on the motion or begging for a second, but you know, it seems to be, just listening into the conversation, a inconsistency with the use of the term rollover. I think some folks are viewing rollover as an underage. Some folks are viewing rollover as an overage. In other words, what do you do with under harvested fish and what do you do with over harvested fish? So I think the term rollover, we maybe just want to change that or take that out of the conversation and say underages and overages, or something that is very clear what everyone's talking about. Because I think some people are viewing that term differently, and that may be causing some confusion.
Yeah, and in one of those, it creates the situation that's been mentioned a few times, which is each segment would act as its own individual cap. It would have to be tracked. So I think that is one of the many issues we seem to be still struggling with. So I think one thing I'd like to do is talk timelines on, does there need to be back and forth potentially, as in the board getting some chance to clarify even by email exchange as the PDT tries to work through this, and then just to know, what would be that timeline? When would we see a document again for consideration to go out?
Yeah, I just, you kind of just said it there, but I was going to say, just say, hey, James and the PDT, give it another shot. I think that's not enough. They need some guidance from the board. What are the underlying principles that this board would like to achieve, or at least have the range of options achieved in this document? Because there seems to be quite a range of that around the table right now. Because one of the things that's in the FMP now and has always been part of the FMP is that an underage of the bay cap is not allowed to be carried forward to the next year and added to the subsequent year's quota. And I think that, I assume most folks around the board want to maintain that sort of premise of how the bay cap operates. And, and establishing a few of those definitive guidelines to the PDT, I think would be really helpful. I don't know if we can do it today, or I hate is a strong word. I'm reluctant to set up another working group, and maybe we need a working group of board members to advise the PDT, or at least to be a sounding board for the PDT as the PDT moves forward. So, anyway, staff can help. We're willing to do it, but we just need some guidance from this group.
Spud just volunteered to be the. Go ahead.
What is the status of this motion? So we don't have a second?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Correct. There was no
All right.
second to the motion. The
All right.
motion fails.
I would like to offer a second, because I think if we don't clear this up about the rollover, we're actually tying the hands of the PDT for the next iteration of this, because now we've got a motion that says no rollovers. And for the reasons that Bob was describing, rollovers is meaning too many different things to too many different people in too many circumstances. So if we remove that, will that not then allow the PDT to have the flexibility to address this differently, like has been discussed with terms that mean what we think they mean, which is underages, overages, that sort of thing. So I would offer a second so we can reconsider that and maybe clear that up if that's necessary.
Yes, it would be. So we do have a second from the prevailing side. So we have a motion before us to reconsider, including the no rollover option. Bob, you should have sat closer.
I think we're just procedurally where we are right now with this, now that Spud has seconded this motion, is that if this passes, it's just setting up the board's ability to reconsider that motion. By passing this, it doesn't automatically null and void that previous motion. So this is just sort of allowing the board to go back and talk about that previous motion and reconsider it, and then take another vote if they want to either change the outcome of that previous vote or just sort of remove that motion from the record. So that, procedurally, we're in a spot where it's going to take two votes to either modify or remove the motion that was passed earlier in this meeting.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad all of that's on the record. So with that, I'm not looking for a great deal of discussion on this, but I do want to know if folks need a chance to caucus. Or Roy, did you have?
Mr. Chairman, my recollection is this would require a 2/3 vote. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Sarah?
Mr. Chairman, could we check our Robert's rules? I think a motion to reconsider is non-debatable.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And so I just did want to know if folks needed a chance to caucus, though. Yes, okay. So we'll give 1 minute and we will ensure that the 2/3 applies here as well.
So Joe, the motion to reconsider only takes a simple majority. I think folks may be thinking about the commission's special rule on reconsidering final actions, where if a quota is set or FMP was approved, or along with conservation equivalency, et cetera, are approved, those do take a 2/3 vote. But this motion does not fall under that commission's special rule. So it's simple majority.
Okay, somehow we're getting rowdier. So I'd like to bring us back to the table. All right, I'm going to call the question to reconsider. All of those in favor?
Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, New Jersey.
Opposed?
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, North Carolina.
No votes? Abstentions?
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries.
Motion passes 13-3 to 2-0. All right. So we'll bring up the motion. Okay. Further discussion, Doug?
I just want to be clear on what proper process would be here. If I was to just essentially say to remove the no rollover provision from section 3.2.3, would that be accurate? Just vote on this?
Look to Bob.
Vote this?
Yeah, it essentially just re-vote on this. And if the will of the group is to not add a no rollover provision, a lot of negatives there, not add a no rollover provision, vote against this. Yeah, we don't have to, this doesn't have to be changed at all. You essentially we're resetting ourselves to about an hour and a half ago and re-voting on that motion we had this morning.
Right. So a motion against this would simply keep it out of the document.
And you're going to be allowing discussion on that, right? Well, again, I will, if I may,
Go ahead,
Mr. Chairman, I feel we had a document before us that could have had some minor modifications to it and be ready to go out to the public. But when we started adding this in, as much as I saw what the state of Maryland was trying to do and give, more options, it seems to have affected what the purpose of the document was. We'd have to come up with a different document, and it was going to delay this going out for public hearing. So I would support a no vote on this rollover position.
Dennis Abbott.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I support my fellow commissioner's position. I think when we voted initially in favor of this, we didn't understand the bag of worms that we were creating. It's been in history that we've put a lot of things into documents that we knew weren't going to pass or whatever. But this is one that's really caused too much of a problem. So again, I oppose this motion.
Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad we're going to revisit this. When you're working on the water and efficiencies, and there's a million things that can affect what happens, whether it's a cold spring, cold summer, hurricane, oil spill, ship hitting a bridge. You might not be able to get where you want to fish. You might not catch a quota. We've decided how much quota could possibly be harvested in this area, and to give the fishermen a chance to catch it at whatever time of year is available to them, I think is a good idea. So I'm glad we're going to get a chance to do this again.
Mike Louisi.
So much for breaking the ice, Mr. Chairman. We did have a lot of ice down here this year. The ice was thick. Joking aside, I had no idea when I made the motion that something that would be more inclusive was going to create the chaos that ensued over the last hour and a half. Personally, I'm viewing this as I prefer action over delay and more complications in us trying to solve some kind of math riddle that, is just going to be overly burdensome. And, after having the hour and a half conversation, it's opened my eyes to what would have to happen as a result of having these no rollover provisions in. So at this point right now, again, action over delay, and more having it be more complicated, I'm inclined to oppose adding the no rollover provision, and I will change my vote on that.
Other discussion? Need to caucus? I see a hand from the public. You want to comment on this? Okay, please come up. You have 1 minute.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Kate Wilkie with the Nature Conservancy. I understand not wanting to get wrapped around the axle and delay this action, but I just want to say there's been a lot of discussion about punitive measures and trying to avoid them, and this addendum is not meant to be punitive. It's about responding to an ecological warning sign. And when menhaden aren't being caught during a certain quota period, it's a canary in a coal mine. It's a signal, and the fish aren't available. So low catch rate means low abundance. And the quota period structure simply ensures that we're paying attention to that canary rather than ignoring it. And importantly, the fishery can still operate and harvest menhaden outside of the bay. So just something to consider, sort of the heart of this addendum. So I'm not really in favor of delaying or not delaying. I just wanted to put that on the record. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that. I have one other hand in the public. If you could please state your name, and we'll start the clock.
Good. Well, I was going to say good morning, but it's good afternoon almost now. My name is Jason Joyce. I serve as the Director of Advocacy for the New England Fishermen's Stewardship Association. We just witnessed an hour and a half of a cautionary tale of, in my opinion, putting the cart before the horse. There's an agenda, and NEFSA respectfully, I'm their advocate for their fishermen. We respectfully urge the board to pause this action, refer these questions to the technical committee, ensure decisions are grounded in a full and objective scientific review. We've seen this. I'm on several boards in my state, and we've seen this happen. I agree with Steve. When Steve Train brought this up, I was like, you're right on. And as I listened, it's like, wow, you just created a giant mess. And my fear and our association's fear is that this is full of this, and it's going to create more of a problem. We would like to see this go back and come back from your committee. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to bring us back to the table, and just a reminder that, as Bob stated, this motion is to add one item So we are completely restarting. So go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, just like I said, I don't think I'm ready to change my vote on this one just yet. And I only say that because I don't think we had a discussion where everybody understood what each other was saying, that we were using terms interchangeably. And I don't think that discussion was leading to a resolution that I felt comfortable with, that we all knew what we were doing. So I'm just not ready to take it out yet, but that's just explaining my vote here. Thank you.
Okay, not seeing any other hands. I'm going to call the question, and I'll read it once more. Move to add a no rollover provision to section 3.2.2.3. All those in favor, please raise your hand.
Connecticut, North Carolina, Rhode Island,
Those opposed?
Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, New Jersey.
No. Abstentions?
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries.
Okay. Motion fails 3-13-2-0. James puts the proper thing in order there. So that was 2 abstentions, 0 nulls. Okay. We've had quite a few comments about the need for this document to go back to the PDT regardless of whether or not there was this addition. So I'd like to get a feel for the will of the board if that, unless there's an objection. Allison, go ahead.
Didn't mean to interrupt you mid-sentence, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to have you finish your thought if you'd like.
I was going to say, unless there's a motion to try and move this forward, then I would like to confirm a timeline on what happens between our now and our next board meeting. So.
Yeah, thank you. This is actually what I had my hand up about 10, 15 minutes ago, whatever that was. So, I understand we have spent a lot of time on this document, and I'm not surprised. It's a very complicated document. However, we still have about 40 minutes left in this meeting and at least 3 sections of the document that we haven't discussed that I think the PDT could also use some guidance on, and potential for clarity and simplification from the board that we wouldn't have to spend time doing if we do send it back to the PDT and come back to another meeting. So, I personally would have a preference to just kind of continue grinding through if it's the will of the board and your discretion, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks. I think one other thing we can do is go on to the other items and then get back to James and we can lay out a little bit more of what the timing would look like. So if Nicole.
Sorry, I just wanted to, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to bring us back to a suggestion that Bob had made earlier. I think everyone's in agreement that there's a lot more work to be done on this document. I'm not against to what Allison said, but I'm still not sure that we're going to be able to get through everything that people want to get through in the next 40 minutes. So I'm wondering if it is possible to form a work group to work with the PDT so that at the next meeting, we don't have to delay this action further.
Okay, if we do a work group, I would like a motion, and I'd like a motion that discusses potential membership. I have to admit, I don't remember how the last working group was formed. Somehow ended up on there, Spud, but I don't remember how we formed it. So, Tony?
The last time we had a work group, we accepted nominations from the board, and then the chair identified who would be put on that. The work groups are usually 6 people. And the chair is not always the chair.
Isn't that right, John? Okay. So I yeah, we can do that. And so that would be something that the board would see through an email exchange on nominations. Is that correct, Tara?
Yes.
Nicole, would you mind making a motion to that effect if that's what you'd like to see?
Sure, I can make that motion. Move to form a working group of the Atlantic Menhaden Management Board to work with the PDT on the draft addendum for the next meeting in August.
Second by John Clark. Would either of you like to speak to it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, again, think that this board has a lot of changes they'd still like to be made in the draft addendum. I think the PDT did a great job, but these matters are just very complex, and sometimes it's very difficult to review all of these items and get everything done in the first shot. So I think the board would just be more comfortable having more time, but we also don't want to delay approving this for public comment past August, and then we get into implementation issues for next year. So I think by forming the work group, we can provide some really constructive feedback to the PDT and get a more solid document back in August that would allow us to potentially approve it for public comment at that time.
John, anything to add?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I agree with what Nicole said, that, the document, because of what the board already asked, is very complicated, so it'd be great to streamline it. And I would just further suggest that perhaps just reconstituting the working group that we already had might streamline things. And we'll put you right back in it, Joe.
Thanks, John. Further discussion, Rob?
I agree with John on that last part. I think that the group that worked on this and put together the working group report is knowledgeable on the issues and would have the opportunity to kind of come back and work with the PDT. I think that you've already we are trying to move this along. I do think you already have people educated on the topics, and I think it would definitely help them be more efficient.
All right, well, those sentiments aren't specified either way in the motion. So I think I will want to hear more about the board's will on that. I saw some hands here. Was it David? Did you have your hand up?
I was just going to say, I can support this, but I think to try to eliminate some of the confusion we heard today, it would be useful to have a time period, 1-2 weeks, whatever, to allow board members to submit written comments so that the staff and the PDT get very specific advice on the revisions that are going to come forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we could do that with consent unless there's objection to that notion. I agree. So Eric, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I fully support the motion. Whether or not the working group is the previous working group, I have maybe some fresh eyes might be good with that. But I certainly hope that I'm listening to Mr. Grist from Virginia. There are operational difficulties he's going to have with some of these options. And I don't want to have a list of options that are not doable. So hopefully that will be some of the discussion, like these aren't workable. And maybe we remove some of the undoable stuff from this document. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's fair, and I would expect that our partners in Virginia will be paying close attention to this. Let's see. I think we can handle this motion without necessarily defining who is on the work group. I think we should allow some time for past members to step down if they need to. And we can look at other nominations through, I think, through an email process. Russell, I saw your hand up, and then I'll go to Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About 3 years ago, when I spoke and said we had a problem in the Menhaden industry in Maryland, I didn't say what the problem was. I didn't say what this board has done, in my opinion, has taken the reduction fishery and set them out like a white elephant. That's the problem. You can't tell me that that's the only problem we got with Menhaden not coming into Maryland, coming up the bay. You can blame it on the reduction fishery if you want, but I remember when 3 companies were working out of Virginia, Haney, Smith, and the company working now. there's other problems, and I don't think that we're touching them at all. I don't think the last working group touched them. Sorry, but I just don't think it did. There's something wrong with the Chesapeake Bay is not allowing fish to come up into Maryland. They've done it for hundreds of years, and we've caught them. But all of a sudden, in the last 3 or 4 years, they've stopped. And I don't, in my opinion, you can put all the rules on a reduction fishery you want, but you're still not going to find the problem until we look further into what's causing it. We haven't done that. It's our responsibility to find that and not just say, oh, well, it's easy, we'll blame this one group. I don't believe that. And I'm coming from a history of bogey boat captains. My 2 nephews were captains. My cousin's husband was a captain. My brother was a captain for 40 years out of Empire, Louisiana, in the Menhaden industry. And I just don't think they're the culprit. That they're all the culprit. We got other problems, and I'm not saying they're not part of it, but I'm saying we should find something that we should look for something else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Russell. I saw Doug Grout, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Now that we have half an hour left, my suggestion was going to be, yes, let's vote up this committee, but let's spend the time that the board has here trying to work on some of the issues right now, as opposed to sending to a committee and then having debate discussion about that later. I think the last 2 items on our agenda, we could easily move to the next meeting if it's your will. But obviously we're not going to get through the entire addendum right now. But I think this is more important that we start the discussion right now, and then let the committee finish it up.
Okay, Doug. Yeah, and believe it or not, we haven't really gone through that possibility of delaying the other 2 report outs to us. But I think with this motion that I'd like to call, but I think this is going to formally be, potentially, if this motion passes, the action as far as the draft addendum, that it is going back, and it's going back with a group that's going to be working on it. If we do need to cover still further direction, I guess, yeah, I'd rather stay focused on that, and not lose time, or be doing everything by email exchange alone. So I guess, is there further discussion on this, or can we, John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not further motion, discussion, just curious as to whether we need to add anything in about, the PDT asked if the technical committee could review some of the things such as the catch per unit effort. When I looked at the CES report, as I mentioned earlier, it was really great about the reduction fishery, but I was just curious if we can get some economic analysis of what's happened to the pound net fishery in Maryland, since we heard so much about it. And surprised to hear from Mike that blue catfish are actually the top fish caught, and how that's affected the economics of the whole thing. So just interested there.
So John, is that something that you would like to see as a separate item, kind of like what we have as some of these later agenda items, or is that something you're saying should be part of the document?
Right, for just to help when we do get back to the addendum next time, just for our discussion. I mean, there was some question about what is going on between the catch per unit effort and the pound net fishery compared to the reduction fishery. The economics, as I said, just something I'm just curious about there, what the impact would be in terms of the effect on employment and so on.
Okay, thanks. Tony?
John, we can look into the economics. I don't know if the state of Maryland has any data that they would be able to give us for the pound net fishery, but right now the CES report does not have has no specifics on economic data. So
And one other thing, John, that I think is helpful that you noted, and I guess then the question would be the ability of this working group to possibly use the technical committee for any further analysis, or is that something that we would like to see specifically tasked?
I think, you know, generally the management board tasks technical committees with work, but if the board's comfortable delegating that to the working group, I think that's completely in bounds. And in this case, probably reasonable. It sounds like, you know, this board wants to be in a position to approve this document in August for public hearing. So, you know, we have to streamline the process to get it from where we are now to approvable in August. So anything you can do to make that efficient is in bounds, I think.
All right, so I would like board members then to consider that, that with this motion, that there's an assumption that since the PDT specific, you know, this motion is clear that this board working group will be working with the PDT. The PDT had mentioned that they'd like to have the technical committee look at some of the analysis. So I would say then that voting in favor of creating this working group is with the assumption that would happen. So, all right. Are we ready for the question on this? Okay. All of those in favor, please raise your hand.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, New Jersey.
Any opposed? No. Abstentions?
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and no fisheries.
And no nulls. 0-2-0. Motion passes 16-0 with 2 abstentions. So Doug, I think, you know, to what you were saying, again, unless there's anything more specific, I think we can consider this, you know, this action item done until it, you know, until that working group is formed. So, Tony?
So we'll ask for those nominations pretty quickly out of email, but I wanted to, I think David Borden suggested some time to allow board members also to provide edits. I think what we're going to do is send you a Word version of the document and I think we would most appreciate just redlining it. So track your changes and send them back to James in order for to most efficiently try to deal with that. And it's harder for us to read your minds when you give us concepts versus you all doing the editing.
So the only other thing I think that we want to be sure is that it's, again, not in the motion, but the idea would be that we would, the Menhaden board would be on the ASOC's next agenda for a meeting, and we'll pick all this up on where we are. Okay. All right. So with that, we can move on to our next agenda item, the long overdue. Sorry about that, Caitlin. Oh, Bob, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Now, just a scheduling thing. You know, if we can squeeze in the next 2 presentations and then my brief comments on the Chesapeake Bay work by about 11:45, that would be great. A few extra minutes. Do we think that's workable?
That would be my hope, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so, yes. So I'll turn it over to Caitlin for the TC report.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Craig. I'm with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and I am the current Atlantic Menhaden Technical Committee Chair. And I'm just going to briefly go over the Menhaden Environmental Literature Review that the Technical Committee conducted over the last few months. So the literature review stemmed from 2 board tasks. One being to evaluate the possible effect of cold water on the continental shelf on Menhaden migration, migratory patterns, and particularly in relation to the timing of osprey arrival, nesting, and breeding. And then the other task was to consider what role water temperature, dissolved oxygen levels, shoreline hardening, and other environmental factors play in the local abundance of menhaden and other forage fish species in the Chesapeake Bay. As a response to these tasks, the TC discussed that in order to provide a comprehensive quantitative answer to these specific tasks would require a significant amount of time and data. And so as a first step, the TC prepared this literature review on just some key topics that were identified by the board. And so the review summarizes the current state of knowledge on these topics and can serve as a basis for further quantitative work if the board so desires. And this presentation is just going to focus on some high-level takeaways from each of the topics that we looked at. And for a more detailed discussion, you can see the full memo that was in the supplemental materials. So the topics that I'm going to go over briefly today will be the 2025 State of the Mid-Atlantic Ecosystem, Menhaden environmental preferences, osprey timing and milestones, environmental preferences for other forage species, shoreline hardening impacts, and then briefly just some TC notes on what we found. So the first topic, the 2025 Ecosystem Report. The northeastern U.S. shelf waters have been experiencing a long-term warming trend in annual and seasonal temperatures. In 2024, however, the shelf environment was unusual compared to 2020 through 2022. So the shelf waters were cooler, they were less saline, and they were less buffered. Also, the cold pool was larger and more persistent, and it was also noted that the timing and availability of some species to different fisheries was reported as being different in 2024 than the other years. So in 2024, the Chesapeake Bay did not actually experience this similar anomaly that was seen on the shelf. And there was continued trends for above average water temperatures and low dissolved oxygen. The 2024 shelf conditions related to the variability in the Gulf Stream. So when the Gulf Stream is further north, you're getting warmer waters in the mid-Atlantic, but when it's further south, you're getting cooler waters in the mid-Atlantic. So this variability with the Gulf Stream moving between being north and south will continue in the future, but this isn't necessarily going to reverse the long-term warming trends that have been seen. So because of this makes short-term predictions about the environmental conditions more difficult. The next topic was menhaden environmental preferences. So adult migration patterns have been documented from tagging, fishery, and ichthyoplankton survey data. So menhaden spawn offshore of the Carolinas in winter and then begin migrating inshore and northward in early spring, with some reaching the Gulf of Maine by June. Larger and older fish tend to migrate further, and then in fall they begin migrating south to the Carolinas again. Not all of the adults migrate, and this has been shown through tagging data, larval data, and recent survey data. And these different data sets indicate that many adults actually stay in the mid-Atlantic or the southern New England region over the winter, and they spawn there. So the highest larval abundance tends to be south during the winter, but larvae are present almost year-round up to southern New England, indicating a protracted spawning season across a wide spatial range. Larvae are carried inshore to nursery grounds, and so recruitment to any one estuary or region is influenced by numerous environmental and biological factors. This could include time and location of spawning, number of eggs produced, Gulf Stream patterns, temperature, windstorms, and other factors. So there is, in general, a large body of literature on the environmental factors influencing Atlantic menhaden recruitment and growth. However, there's less information on the environmental preferences of adults and how that affects the abundance and migration patterns. So overall in the literature, adults seem to have generally just a broad habitat envelope that they can encompass, but there does seem to be a preference for shallower inshore waters. The next topic was osprey timing in the Chesapeake Bay. So the birds arrive in March, and then they lay the eggs in April. These eggs hatch during mid-May through mid-June, and then fledging occurs mid-July to early August, and then departure of the birds out of the area occurs late August to mid-October. And no information on the environmental cues that are driving these particular events was found, and there's also no information on whether the timing has changed for these events over time. The next topic was looking at other forage fish environmental preferences. So the TC focused on a limited number of species that have been identified as important forage within the Chesapeake Bay, either currently or historically. These include alewife and blueback herring, or river herring collectively, then bay anchovy, juvenile spot, and croaker. So alewife and blueback herring, their spawning migration and the juvenile out migrations in the bay tend to be triggered mostly by temperature. For bay anchovy, they have a wide range of suitable temperature and salinity conditions and are seen up and down the coast. The biomass in the bay peaks in summer and fall, and then winter biomass in the bay tends to be correlated with water temperature. For juvenile spot and croaker, they're tolerant of a wide range of conditions, more so than the adult fish. The last topic is shoreline hardening impacts, and studies have found either that there's no effect on shoreline hardening on menhaden abundance when compared to the natural sites, or there's actually a higher abundance at these hardened sites. So the effects of shoreline hardening are variable across species and estuaries, so they can range from negative effects to no effects to positive effects on the overall species diversity and individual species abundance at these hardened sites when compared to the natural sites. And so for the TC discussion, overall from this literature review, we found that many factors within a species' physical environment will influence the abundance, distribution, and timing of the population events such as spawning and migration. And if the board would like more quantitative information, the TC requests guidance on the parameters and the relationships that would be of the greatest interest to the board. And we did want to note that even with more focused tasking that comes from the board, the existing data sets, they might not be able to spatially and temporally sufficiently address the board's questions in a quantitative way. And that is it. So with that, I can take any questions.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. I just want to remind folks that this report started out as a task from the board, so I'm going to keep questions and comments just around the table. Questions on the report? Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Caitlin, for your presentation. Very informative. But this board also tasked the technical committee to consider the role of water temperature, dissolved oxygen, and other environmental factors relative to menhaden abundance off of Long Island, and particularly the bays of eastern Long Island. And the report doesn't mention this additional tasking relative to Long Island. So I'm just wondering what the status is of the TC addressing that additional tasking. Thank you.
Thanks, Emerson. So yeah, you're right. We didn't include specifically the Eastern Long Island information into the report. But I guess in general, from the literature research, the studies from Eastern Long Island, and specifically Eastern Long Island, are pretty limited. So we weren't necessarily excluding our initial search. We weren't excluding that area or limiting to Chesapeake Bay. But it wasn't necessarily enough to kind of make it into this specific memo, or really to differentiate it from what's kind of happening just in general in the mid-Atlantic or the rest of the Atlantic coast, as what we noted in the report.
Follow up, Emerson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Caitlin. So then I would request that either, this TC memo be revised to include the explanation that you just gave, or if there's going to be, a future memo based on any other feedback on some of the bullets you had up there, that it explicitly consider the issues for Eastern Long Island. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emerson. Any other questions, John Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the work that the TC did, Caitlin. That was really impressive. I was just curious, in the materials, we received an analysis done by Dr. Vale Levinson of Florida. That was, I found it very interesting, although I didn't really understand parts of it with the wavelet coherence. But the upshot of it seems to be that they were looking at hypoxia actually leading to higher Menhaden catches in Maryland pound nets because of the way it would concentrate them. And just curious if the TC would be having a chance to, I don't mean to be putting more tasks on the TC, but I'd just like to see if they could take a look at that, the TC, and maybe comment on it for the next meeting. Thanks.
Yeah, the TC has not received that material, but if the board would like to task us with reviewing and commenting on it, we can add it to the list of things to do.
I'll look around the table. Any objection to that? Not seeing any, so John will add that. Other questions or comments on the TC report? Great, we can move on. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Job well done. So I believe we have Dr. Sheldon for the review of the Committee on Economics and Social Sciences. Andrew, are you there?
Yep. Should I share or can? Oh, you got my slides. Cool. All right. Perfect. So yeah, my name's Andrew Sheldon. I'm a resource economist at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and representing the Committee on Economics and Social Sciences of the ASMFC, who was asked to investigate how some of the proposed measures in Addendum 2 could impact jobs in the fishery, and specifically the reduction fishery. I know that topic has come up in some of the discussion about jobs in other sectors of the fishery, and to my knowledge, there's not studies or data that's kind of been used to analyze that previously. All right, so our approach was to review existing literature and draft the memo that was distributed to you all, interpreting that research. We're relatively lucky with this species. We often don't have as much socioeconomic data and studies as we might wish we did, but there were two relevant reports that had been published previously, one of which was funded by the ASMFC, the 2017 report. And the Kirkley report was done, I believe, preceding the introduction of the Chesapeake Bay quota cap initially, and so it was structured to sort of inform that initial discussion. So quite relevant here. Next slide. So the key findings that are kind of relevant for discussion here: Kirkley 2011 report explored regional economic impacts of the Menhaden industry, including the effects of the reductions in the Chesapeake Bay quota cap. They noted that the reduction sector supports about 519 full and part-time jobs, including 347 in Northumberland County specifically. And their model estimated, the output of their model indicated that reductions of the Chesapeake Bay quota cap corresponded to job losses of about 3.7 total jobs per 1,000 metric ton reduction, which would be 2.1 jobs in the reduction sector directly, and then the 1.6 jobs in kind of supporting industries in the regional economy. Whitehead and Harrison used a very similar approach and really kind of leveraged a lot of the data initially collected in Kirkley. So it's hard to sort of interpret their results differently because there's really a lot of overlap in the data that was informing their estimates. And they didn't specifically explore impacts of reductions in the Chesapeake Bay quota cap. They were looking more at the coast-wide fishery. They estimated employment changes in Northumberland County at approximately one job per $45,000 dockside. And with adjusting for inflation, that's about 60,000 in today's dollars. Next slide. So yeah, some limitations. Every study has its limitations and caveats, of course. So neither study looked at kind of seasonal impacts if there was restrictions put on seasonal harvest. So they can't really inform that. We might expect, though, I think it's reasonable to expect that if seasonal restrictions constrain periods of high catch efficiency or location of where that catch is occurring, it could limit the ability to maintain processing throughput and have some cost side and potentially employment side impacts. But the studies didn't really provide any information there. The main limitation, which we highlighted in the memo, and I'll note here, is that both studies use a pretty standard approach, Leontief input-output models. Basically, they look at cost structures in an industry and in relation to the amount of output being produced, and then assume that kind of if output were to go up or down, that the cost structure wouldn't change, essentially. And so employment would kind of scale up or down linearly with changes in output. So that little kind of graphic on the top right is showing that assumption. The solid line would show kind of that linear scaling between sector employment and fishery landings. Whether that's reasonable or not is difficult to discern with the kind of with the reports that are available and the data that's available. One might expect different types of responses, like that dash line where you kind of have pretty stable employment until some point where it starts to rapidly decline, or that dotted line where employment impacts are also maybe not so substantial at initial reduction levels, and then there's some point at which the operation becomes non-viable in employment, the sector collapses. So we don't really have any information to inform sort of where those threshold trigger points might be, but I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that they could exist and that we wouldn't just have sort of this consistent linear response. So that's the main limitation. Though again, the approach they used is pretty standard for looking at these types of questions. We did pass the memo on to industry, to the reduction industry for review and any comment, and they noted that one of the scenarios Kirkley looked at in that 2011 report was if there was no allowable harvest in the Chesapeake Bay. And the industry response was that kind of is unrealistic to expect that the industry would be at all operational in that scenario. And again, I think that the result from Kirkley that illustrates that is due to that linear response in employment to reductions in quota. Next slide. Last thing I'll note is that both of these reports highlighted that the reduction industry is a critical economic driver in this area, and that job losses could create structural unemployment. So it's the industry that sort of ties everything together in this area. It has obviously high levels of direct employment, but also strong levels of sort of indirect employment in ancillary industries. So could job losses could kind of reverberate throughout sectors in that economy. Broadly, we have recommendations for where additional research would be useful. Getting at these drivers of employment and what responses of employment are to changes in quota or changes in landings would be quite useful. Again, the major limitation or major assumption of those prior models is that linear response. Cost and production structures for both reduction and bait, there really has been much done, to our knowledge, on the bait sector. And also maybe updating data from these reports. Kirkley is getting 2011 starting to be a bit in the distance. And then looking at demand drivers for the bait sector, that's also, I think, we think an important area that's not been really explored too much. So that's it. I'll take any questions or comments. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I'm going to stick with the board questions on the report. Doug Hammond.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thank you for the report. I find fascinating as we get age on some of these predictive models, when we can look back and see whether they were actually right or not. And so did the committee at all look at the fact that we've had 15 years and a reduction of 34,000 pounds in the cap? Did we lose 125 jobs in the industry or not? And That's the 3.7 jobs per 1,000 tons. And did anybody look at that and assess?
So we haven't had the data to look at that. I agree. Doing some retrospective analysis probably would be useful to inform this conversation. I will note that the other report, the Whitehead report, looked at changes in sector level employment in response to landings changes, if there was just any correlation there throughout. And this was not focused on reduction, was coastwide, so would primarily be picking up signals from the bait sector, and they did not find strong correlation there. But again, bait sector could be quite different in terms of employment dynamics. So yeah, I agree. I don't know. The CES didn't have sort of the data available to investigate that, but certainly something worth looking into.
Good question. Allison?
Well, Doug kind of hit my question right on the head. We've had observations since the Kirkley paper was published, and actually since that publication have reduced the bay cap by 50,000 metric tons. And so, yeah, I would be curious as well to see if those predictions have actually come to fruition. I think the one thing that struck me, and one of the most important caveats of these models, which I am not super familiar with, is the assumption that there's no adaptive behavior in the fishery. And so I'm wondering if Andrew or anyone else has some thoughts on if we haven't seen a dramatic reduction in employment in the fishery, why that might be. Are there changes in the way that it's operating that are offsetting those potential losses?
Yeah, so like a general comment on, so I think the linear assumption is very strong. That's kind of getting at what you're noting, not having sort of adaptation or input substitution, right? So like if it's often found most difficult to, or companies often are cutting jobs is one of the last sort of measures that companies often do. They'll kind of reorganize production structures. And this, again, is not Menhaden specific, but I think generally true. Companies will kind of reorganize production inputs to kind of minimize costs and without necessarily cutting employment. That's one of the last sort of cost-cutting measures that companies often take. So that said, there's a lot of potential. I think businesses often have a lot of potential to kind of adaptively respond to changes in prices and costs. And that would, building a model that would incorporate that would introduce a lot of realism in how the sector operates. It doesn't exist here. It doesn't mean it couldn't in the future, but it doesn't exist right now. And there certainly are like existing sort of economic models and frameworks that accommodate that sort of thing. It just isn't used here. I don't know if that totally answers your question.
Yes, you're getting a thumbs up, Andrew. I'll look around the table. I do want to note that both of these presentations from the technical committee and economics are in the meeting materials. In the interest of time, for members of the public that would like to comment on these, I would ask that they do that through written comment provided to James. James will ensure that gets out to the board. I think that's going to be the easiest way for all of us to digest your comments while we're waiting to digest our lunch. So, John Clark, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the excellent report there, Andrew. I just would really like to see for the recommended additional research go forward, especially on the cost and production structures, reduction in bait. Just curious, I mean, the result of this addendum could be that it would be transferring harvest from reduction to bait, and how does that affect employment in both sectors? How does that affect the revenue? And that would just be something really interesting to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's we will. I don't know if we would amend the memo or how we would address that, but yeah, we will take that into consideration, and I'll bring that back to the full SES next time we meet. I just want to follow up with one final thing on my previous response. about the sort of adaptive behavior response. So I think it's important to kind of recognize, and maybe I'm repeating myself, so sorry if that's the case, but that when firms have this kind of adaptive response, and employment is maybe one of the last sort of cost-cutting measures that a business would take, that's what sets up that potential for a big trigger event, for a threshold past which a business either can't operate at all or has to make very substantial employment cuts. So I think that is a concern. We don't really know. Certainly, reductions in Chesapeake Bay quota should be expected to impose costs on the reduction sector. How they manage those costs is not totally clear given the analyses and data we have presently, but I would expect, if they are adapting, there probably is some threshold past which you might see employment kind of reduce dramatically. I don't know if that clears it up or makes the water more muddy, but felt I should get that out there.
You good, John? Okay. All right. Appreciate that. Any other questions or comments from the board? Not seeing any. Andrew, thank you again. And thanks to the TC and the CES for all the work to date. And yeah, I think we'll always have some more questions for you guys. So with that, we can move on to the next agenda item, and I'll go to Bob.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly, I think as most folks around the table know, Congress appropriated $2.5 million to do Menhaden research within the Chesapeake Bay, and that money will be moving through ASMFC. We don't have access to that money yet, and that's not critical of our partners at NOAA Fisheries. I think they got their final apportionment on, 3 weeks ago or so. So that money will be moving to the commission. The idea is that those funds will be spent on, and only can be spent on, research within the Chesapeake Bay. And the roadmap for essentially Menhaden research in the Bay that was formed at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science in October of 2023 will be the starting point for all this work. And that, for folks that don't recall, that roadmap was developed by folks from VIMS, other Virginia universities, University of Maryland, Center for Environmental Sciences or Studies. There was, industry representatives there, recreational representatives, VMRC reps, Maryland reps. So it was a broad group of folks that got together and developed this roadmap. And it has essentially 3 parts: ecology, fishery impacts, and economic importance of the fishery. So those will be the primary focus areas for the funding. We don't know exactly how much ASMFC will receive. We don't know if money will be taken off the top at NOAA Fisheries before it moves to us. We're at the staff level right now developing an RFP, and we're kind of contemplating, should it be multiple RFPs for each of these categories or one combined RFP? We're leaning toward one combined RFP with different focus areas that folks can submit proposals. And we're also working on the establishment of a review panel that will, obviously look over these proposals that we receive and make the selection. So that's where we are. We're waiting on the funding from NOAA, but we are, initiating the RFP development, and we're kind of ready to hit the ground running once we have access to those funds, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Bob. Questions for Bob? Rob?
Bob, I'm very happy that you were able to finally get that money. It's great that it happened that way. I guess my question is the study report that you mentioned, the 2 things. Can you get that to James so we could, maybe other folks, I think there's a lot of information in it. I'd love to be able to review that, and I'm always happy to talk more about that particular study because I think it's critically important. Thank you.
Yeah, we can send that around to the board. James already has it because he sent it to me. So yeah, we're in good shape.
Any other questions on this? Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Bob, for your review, and thanks to everybody, whoever it was that helped to get that funding through Congress. So what I'm wondering is that $2.5 million sufficient to fund those 3 components? And was that the total ask, or was there the anticipation that other funds might be needed as well? Thank you.
That was the total ask, and that was the price that was attached to this work in 2023. So it may not be enough to cover real in-depth work for all these three different categories. We'll just have to see what we get as far as proposals. There, and this is just 1 year funding from Congress. It's not a, recurring 2.5 million. There was contemplation for money to come out of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'm not sure of the status of that, but as far as I know, it has not been approved. So I think we've got 2.5 million to work with right now.
We good? Okay. I don't see any other hands, Bob, so I think we're all set there. We do have one more action item, which is election of a vice chair. Doug Haymans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Though I don't know why anybody would want to sit in that seat, it is my honor to recommend, to make a motion for the new vice chair to be Miss Nicole Legal Costa from the great state of Rhode Island, my new best friend.
Thank you, Doug. Do I see a second for that? Okay, I'll go with Eric, and yeah, thank you, Nicole, for being willing to. Is there any objection to the motion? Not seeing any, Nicole. I know of a work group that you might be interested in too. Okay, so with that, we do have one other item under other business that I think we can knock out quickly. We do have an AP nomination that came in, so I'll turn to Tina.
Thank you. In your final supplemental materials, you have a nomination for Eric Lortenson to join the panel. He will replace Bob Hanna. He is both a seine net fisherman and an active lobsterman.
Thank you. Will of the board, Nicola?
I would please me to approve the nomination of Eric Lorenzen from Massachusetts to the Atlantic Menhaden Advisory Panel.
Thank you. Do I see a second? Matt? Any discussion on the motion? Any objection? Not seeing any. So that passes. We have a new AP member. Thank you. Any other business to come before us? Not seeing any. All right. Not too bad. Not too bad. All right. Motion to adjourn. Malcolm, second. Joe Grest. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.